Story 1. The Singing Cave. Marcus Webb had been driving logging trucks through the Appalachian Mountains for 17 years, and he thought he'd seen every back road, every hidden trail, and every forgotten hollow in eastern Kentucky. The veteran trucker prided himself on knowing these mountains like the back of his calloused hands, which was why what happened on November 3rd, 2019, shook him to his core and made him question everything he thought he knew about the region he'd spent nearly 2 decades traversing. The job seemed straightforward enough. A small lumber operation outside of Harlan needed hardwood delivered to a furniture manufacturer in West Virginia, and the route took Marcus through some of the most isolated stretches of mountain terrain in the country. He'd made similar runs dozens of times, usually enjoying the solitude and the raw beauty of the ancient mountains. The pay was good for independent contractors, and Marcus had built a solid reputation for reliability and discretion when it came to the sometimes questionable back road shortcuts that saved time and fuel. He left Harlan just after midnight, the cab of his Peterbilt warm against the October chill that had settled into the hollows. The first hour passed uneventfully, the truck's headlights cutting through fog that clung to the winding mountain roads like cobwebs. Marcus had his CB radio tuned to channel 19, but at this hour in this remote area, the airwaves were silent except for occasional static. The radio in his cab played classic country, Johnny Cash crooning about walking the line, and Marcus hummed along while his eyes scanned the treacherous curves ahead. Around 1:30 in the morning, Marcus noticed something odd. He'd been climbing a particularly steep grade, the truck's engine growling as it hauled 12 tons of oak and maple up the mountainside, when he realized he didn't recognize the road. Now, that shouldn't have been possible. Marcus had driven this route at least 20 times, and he had an almost photographic memory for roads and landmarks. But the curve of the pavement, the spacing of the trees, the shape of the rock face to his left, none of it looked familiar. He checked his GPS unit, but the screen showed only a blank gray area with a blinking blue dot representing his truck. No roads, no topographical features, nothing. The device had lost satellite connection, which happened sometimes in these deep hollows, but it usually reconnected within a few minutes. Marcus glanced at his phone and saw the same thing. No service, just the time glowing at 1:47 a.m. The road continued climbing, and Marcus decided to keep going. He'd find a wide spot to pull over, check his paper maps, and figure out where he'd taken a wrong turn. Except he couldn't remember taking any turn at all. He'd been following the main route, hadn't he? The fog had thickened, and maybe he'd missed a fork in the road, taken the wrong branch without noticing. It happened even to experienced drivers. Then he heard the singing. At first, Marcus thought it was coming from his radio, some strange station bleeding through the static. But when he turned the radio off, the singing continued. It was faint, barely audible over the rumble of the diesel engine, but it was definitely there. Multiple voices harmonizing in a way that sounded old, ancient even. The melody was unfamiliar, nothing like the shape note gospel singing he'd heard in mountain churches, but there was something sacred about it, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. The road leveled out, and Marcus saw an opening in the tree line to his right. In the wash of his headlights, he could make out what looked like a wide pull-off area, the kind of scenic overlook that the Forestry Service sometimes maintained. He guided the truck into the space, set the air brakes, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and that strange, persistent singing. Marcus grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The fog was so thick now that his flashlight beam seemed to stop just a few feet in front of him, as if the light itself was being absorbed by the moisture-laden air. The temperature had dropped significantly, and his breath came out in white clouds. The singing was louder now, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest. off to his right where the pull-off area ended and the trees began. He should have gotten back in the truck. Every instinct screamed at him to fire up the engine and get back on the road, find his way to somewhere familiar, somewhere that made sense. But Marcus had always been curious, and there was something about the singing that pulled at him, something that made his feet move toward the tree line almost against his will. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that muffled his footsteps. Marcus pushed through a tangle of mountain laurel and found himself standing at the mouth of a cave. He passed hundreds of caves in these mountains, most of them just shallow depressions in the limestone, but this one was different. The opening was perfectly round, almost artificially smooth, about 8 feet in diameter, and the singing was definitely coming from. Marcus shone his flashlight into the cave. The beam illuminated a tunnel that descended at a gentle angle, the walls smooth and regular. About 30 feet in, the tunnel curved to the right, and the singing echoed from somewhere beyond that curve. The voices were clearer now, and Marcus could almost make out words, though the language wasn't English. It wasn't any language he recognized. He took a step into the cave, then another. The temperature inside was warmer than outside, which struck him as wrong. Caves in this region usually maintained a constant temperature around 55 degrees, but this one felt closer to 70. The air smelled strange too, not the usual mineral smell of cave air, but something organic, almost floral, like jasmine or honeysuckle blooming in the dead of night. As Marcus moved deeper into the cave, following the curve of the tunnel, the singing grew louder and more complex. He could distinguish individual voices now, maybe a dozen of them, ranging from high and clear to deep and resonant. The harmony was intricate, mathematical almost, and it created patterns that seemed to vibrate in his chest cavity, resonating with his heartbeat. The tunnel opened into a chamber, and what Marcus saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cave was vast, far larger than should have been possible given the terrain above. The ceiling soared at least 60 feet overhead, and the walls curved around to form a nearly perfect dome. But it was the floor of the chamber that commanded Marcus's attention. It was covered in symbols, carved or painted in a substance that glowed with a soft, pulsing light. The symbols formed concentric circles, spiraling inward toward the center of the chamber where 12 figures stood. They looked human at first glance, but as Marcus's eyes adjusted to the strange light, he saw the differences. Their proportions were slightly off, limbs a bit too long, fingers with one too many joints. They were dressed in what looked like homespun clothing, but the fabric seemed to shift and change color as they moved. Their faces were the worst part, beautiful and terrible at the same time, with features that were almost right but subtly wrong in ways that made Marcus's brain hurt trying to process them. They stood in a circle, holding hands, and they were singing. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, and the sound that emerged was so pure, so impossibly perfect, that Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. He wanted to join them, wanted to step into the circle and add his voice to theirs, wanted to sing until his throat and his heart stopped. One of the figures turned its head and looked directly at Marcus. Its eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, just infinite darkness. It smiled, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp, too numerous. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard his own ragged breathing, heard the blood pounding in his ears. The 12 figures continued to stare at him, their expressions unreadable. Then, as one, they began to move toward him, not walking exactly, but gliding, their feet not quite touching the glowing symbols on the floor. Marcus ran. He didn't remember making the decision to run. His body simply took over, spinning him around and propelling him back down the tunnel. Behind him, he could hear them coming, could hear a sound like wind rushing through hollow trees, could hear something that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The tunnel seemed longer than before, stretching impossibly ahead of him, the curve that led to the exit nowhere in sight. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. Marcus kept running, one hand trailing along the smooth wall of the tunnel, his boots slipping on stone that felt increasingly wet and organic under his feet. The wall was warm, pulsing rhythmically, and with growing horror Marcus realized it felt like he was inside something alive, something breathing. Then, suddenly, he was outside. He burst from the cave mouth and sprawled face first into the carpet of leaves, his lungs burning, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might rupture. He scrambled to his feet and ran for his truck, not looking back, not allowing himself to think about what might be emerging from that perfectly round opening behind him. Marcus threw himself into the cab, fired up the engine with shaking hands, and threw the truck into gear. The big rig lurched forward, and he guided it back onto the road, accelerating as fast as he dared on the narrow mountain highway. He drove for 2 hours straight, white-knuckled and wild-eyed, until the GPS suddenly blinked back to life and showed him exactly where he was, on Route 119, about 15 miles outside of Jenkins, Kentucky, exactly where he should have been. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the autumn foliage in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus pulled into a truck stop and tried to make sense of what had happened. He checked his watch and his phone. Both showed it was 6:15 a.m. He'd lost almost 3 hours somehow, time that he couldn't account for beyond the maybe 45 minutes he'd spent in that cave. He never found that road again. Tried, on multiple occasions over the following months, retracing his route, looking for any pull-off or cave entrance that matched what he remembered. But the mountain roads looked different in daylight, and even driving the exact same path at night yielded nothing unusual. No strange fog, no loss of GPS signal, no mysterious caves with singing voices. But sometimes, late at night when he's driving through the deepest hollows of Appalachia, Marcus hears it again. Just for a moment, just at the edge of perception, that ancient, perfect harmony drifting through his open window. And every time he hears it, he grips the steering wheel tighter and drives faster, putting as much distance as he can between himself and whatever dwells in those mountains, waiting in caves that exist outside of maps and time, singing songs that were old when the world was young. Story 2. The Hitchhiker's Face. Sarah Chen had been traveling through Appalachia documenting folk traditions for her anthropology dissertation, spending the late summer of 2021 driving a rented Honda CR-V through the backroads of Virginia and Tennessee. The 32-year-old researcher from UC Berkeley had always been fascinated by the cultural isolation of mountain communities, the way old traditions and beliefs persisted in places that modernity seemed to have forgotten. She conducted dozens of interviews, filled 3 notebooks with observations, and recorded hours of audio. She was professional, thorough, and careful, which was why she never should have picked up the hitchhiker. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late August, somewhere between Tazewell and Bluefield, Virginia, on a stretch of Route 460 that wound through dense forest and past abandoned coal mining operations. Sarah had been driving since early morning, and fatigue was starting to set in. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the road, and she was looking for a place to stop for the night when she saw the figure standing by the roadside. The woman appeared to be in her 60s, wearing a long dress that might have been fashionable in the 1940s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wasn't holding out her thumb or making any obvious gestures for a ride, just standing there at the edge of the pavement, perfectly still, watching the traffic pass. There wasn't much traffic. Sarah hadn't seen another vehicle in over 20 minutes, but the woman stood there as if she'd been waiting for hours, days even. Sarah's rational mind told her to keep. She'd heard all the warnings about picking up strangers, especially in remote areas, especially at dusk, but her anthropologist's curiosity was stronger. This woman was clearly local, clearly old enough to have grown up in these mountains before modern influence took hold, and Sarah thought she might be a valuable interview subject. Besides, the woman looked harmless enough, elderly and alone, possibly in need of help. Sarah pulled over about 20 feet past where the woman stood and rolled down the passenger window. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" she called out. The woman turned her head slowly, mechanically, like an owl rotating its skull. She smiled, and even from this distance, Sarah noticed that her teeth were unusually white and perfect, too perfect for someone of her apparent age, especially in a region where dental care had historically been limited. "That would be mighty kind of you, dear," the woman said, her voice thin and reedy with an accent so thick that Sarah had to concentrate to parse the words. "I'm trying to get home before dark." The woman walked to the passenger door, and Sarah noticed something odd about her gait. She didn't bob up and down as she walked, the way humans naturally do. Instead, she seemed to glide, her head remaining at exactly the same height with each step. Sarah told herself it was just the fading light playing tricks, making movement look strange in the growing shadows. The woman opened the door and slid into the passenger seat with unsettling grace. Up close, Sarah could see that her skin had an unusual quality to it, almost waxy, like old paper that had been carefully preserved. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of winter ice, and they didn't quite focus on Sarah's face when she looked at her. "Where are you headed?" Sarah asked, putting the car in gear and pulling back onto the highway. "Just up the road a piece," the woman said. "There's a turnoff about 5 miles ahead on the left. I'll show you where." They drove in silence for a few minutes. Sarah tried to make conversation, asking about the area, about how long the woman had lived here, about local traditions and folklore, her standard interview opener questions. But the woman's answers were vague and unsatisfying, and she seemed more interested in looking at Sarah than looking at the road ahead. "You're not from around here," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "No, I'm from California." "I'm doing research on California," the woman interrupted, still not looking away from Sarah's face. "That's a far piece from here, long way to come." "Yes, well, I'm interested in. You got a pretty face," the woman said abruptly. "Real pretty, smooth, young." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. There was something wrong about the way the woman had said that, something hungry in her voice. She glanced over and saw that the woman was leaning closer, studying Sarah's face with an intensity that was deeply uncomfortable. "Thank you," Sarah said curtly, returning her attention to the road. "Where did you say your turnoff was?" "Just ahead, real soon now." The sun had fully set now, and darkness pressed against the car windows. The headlights illuminated only the narrow stretch of road ahead, and the forest on either side was an impenetrable black wall. Sarah noticed that there were no lights visible anywhere, no houses, no other vehicles, no signs of human habitation at all, just the road and the forest and the darkness. "There," the woman said, pointing to the left. "Right there." Sarah almost missed it. What the woman called a turnoff was barely more than a gap in the trees, a dirt track that looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe decades. No mailbox, no house number, no indication that anyone actually lived down there. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "That doesn't look." "That's it," the woman insisted. "Turn here." Every instinct told Sarah not to turn onto that dark track, but she was already slowing down, already angling the car toward the gap in the trees. She told herself she'd just drive a little way down, drop the woman off, and then turn around and get back to the highway. It would only take a few minutes. The dirt track was in terrible condition, rutted and overgrown, tree branches scraping against the sides of the car as Sarah navigated carefully through the darkness. The headlights seemed weaker somehow, not penetrating as far into the darkness as they should. And the trees, Sarah had the unsettling sensation that they were closing in behind the car, cutting off the exit. "How far down is your house?" Sarah asked, hearing the nervousness in her own voice. "Not far. Keep going." They drove for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably closer to 5, the track winding deeper into the forest, climbing gradually uphill. Sarah was about to insist on stopping, on letting the woman out right here and turning back, when the headlights illuminated a structure ahead. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. The roof had partially collapsed, the windows were broken or missing entirely, and the porch sagged dangerously. No lights shone from inside, and there was no vehicle, no sign that anyone had lived here in decades. The surrounding clearing was overgrown with weeds and scrub brush, and several trees had sprouted right up against the walls, their roots probably destroying what remained of the foundation. "This is your house?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the disbelief out of her voice. "This is home," the woman said, and now her voice sounded different, deeper, with harmonics that hurt Sarah's ears. "Been home for a long, long time." Sarah turned to look at the woman and froze. The woman was staring at her with those pale eyes, but now they reflected the dashboard lights like an animal's eyes, glowing with a greenish iridescence. And her face, something was wrong with her face. It seemed to be shifting, the features sliding around like they weren't quite fixed in place, like she was wearing a mask that didn't fit properly. "You got such a pretty face," the woman said again, and this time she smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp and far too numerous. "I think I'd like to try it on." The woman's hands shot out with impossible speed, grabbing Sarah's face. The fingers were too long, the nails too sharp, and they dug into Sarah's skin with searing pain. Sarah screamed and tried to pull away, but the woman's grip was like iron. The face in front of her was changing now, dissolving, revealing something underneath that was not human, something with skin like bark and eyes like holes in the world. Sarah's hand found the door handle. She threw her weight against the door and it flew open. She tumbled out of the car, the woman's fingers raking across her face as she fell, leaving burning trails across her cheeks and forehead. She hit the ground hard, the air exploding from her lungs, and immediately scrambled to her feet. The thing that had pretended to be a woman was crawling out of the passenger side, its body contorting in ways that violated the laws of physics. It stood up, and now Sarah could see it clearly in the headlights. It was impossibly tall, maybe 8 feet, with limbs that were too thin and bent at too many angles. Its torso was covered in what looked like bark or dried leather, and its head, its head, was a mockery of a human face, a collection of stolen features that didn't quite fit together correctly. "Pretty face," it said in a voice like breaking branches. "Need a pretty face. Mine is so old, so worn, give me yours." Sarah ran. She didn't go for the car. The thing was between her and the driver's side door, but plunged directly into the forest, branches whipping at her face and arms, roots trying to trip her in the darkness. Behind her, she could hear it coming, could hear that horrible voice calling out, "Come back, pretty face, come back." She ran blindly, not knowing which direction she was going, not caring about anything, distance between herself and that thing. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, and warm blood dripped down her face from the scratches left by the thing's claws. The forest was utterly dark, and twice she ran face first into trees, stunning herself but not stopping, never stopping. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, Sarah saw lights ahead. She crashed through a final barrier of brush and found herself on a paved road. Not the dirt track she'd been lured down, but an actual highway with painted lines and reflective markers. A pair of headlights was approaching from her left, and Sarah stumbled into the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. The vehicle, a pickup truck, screeched to a halt. A man in his 40s jumped out, his eyes wide with alarm as he took in Sarah's appearance, her torn clothing, her bleeding face, her wild eyes. "Jesus Christ, lady, what happened to you?" Sarah couldn't speak coherently, could only point back at the forest and sob. The man helped her into his truck and immediately called 911 on his cell phone. Within 20 minutes, police and an ambulance arrived. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and confused. The police searched the area but found nothing. No dirt track, no abandoned cabin, no rental car. Sarah's Honda CR-V was discovered 2 days later, found on a completely different road 30 miles away, the passenger door standing open, Sarah's belongings still inside, but the vehicle completely clean of fingerprints or any evidence of another passenger. The police wrote it off as a possible assault, though they could never find a suspect or determine what had really happened. Sarah's injuries were real enough, deep scratches across her face that required stitches and left permanent scars. But her story didn't make sense, didn't fit into any category of known crime. Sarah never returned to Appalachia. She finished her dissertation using the data she'd already collected and avoided any research that would require her to travel to isolated areas. She moved to Boston, got a job teaching at a small college, and tried to forget. But she still has nightmares. In them, she's back in that car, and the woman with the 2 perfect teeth is reaching for her face, saying over and over, "So pretty, so smooth, so young. I think I'd like to try it on." And sometimes, when Sarah looks in the mirror, she sees her own face and wonders if it's really hers, or if something took it that night in the woods and left her with a copy, a substitute that looks right but isn't quite right since that August evening when she made the mistake of being kind to a stranger who wasn't human at all. Story 3. The town that shouldn't exist. Robert Alderman had been a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative for 15 years, crisscrossing the eastern United States with a trunk full of samples, and a territory that included some of the most remote medical clinics and small-town pharmacies in the region. The 47-year-old father of 3 from Columbus, Ohio, had driven over 1 million miles in his career, and he prided himself on his knowledge of efficient routes, good restaurants, and the kind of roadside motels that offered clean rooms at reasonable prices. He was methodical, organized, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic and reason. That mindset shattered completely during 3 hours in September 2020 in a place called Ashford Hollow, West Virginia, a town that doesn't appear on any map and shouldn't exist at all. The day started normally enough. Robert had morning appointments at a clinic in Beckley and an afternoon meeting with a pharmacy in Lewisburg, with plans to drive to Charleston that evening for a series of appointments the next day. The weather was perfect, early fall sunshine filtering through trees just beginning to show their autumn colors, the temperature in the comfortable low 70s. Robert had made this particular drive dozens of times, and he was listening to a podcast about Civil War history while his mind wandered through the usual thoughts about work, family, and what he needed to accomplish over the next few days. Around 2 in the afternoon, somewhere between Raynell and Quinwood on Route 60, Robert's car started making a strange noise. He was driving a 2018 Toyota Camry, a reliable vehicle that had never given him any trouble, but now there was a rhythmic clicking sound coming from under the hood, accompanied by a slight loss of power. Robert immediately began looking for a place to pull over, not wanting to risk a breakdown on this lonely stretch of mountain highway. That's when he saw the sign, Ashford Hollow 2 miles, services available. Robert didn't remember seeing that sign before, but then again, he usually drove this stretch while lost in thought or conversation on his hands-free phone. He could have passed the sign 100 times without consciously registering it. The clicking under the hood was getting louder, and the car was definitely losing power. So when he saw the turnoff a couple of miles later, another sign reading Ashford Hollow with an arrow pointing right, he took it without hesitation. The road was paved but narrow, winding down into a hollow between steep mountain ridges. The forest pressed close on both sides, and the temperature seemed to drop perceptibly as Robert descended into the valley. Within a few minutes, the trees opened up and revealed a small town nestled in the bottom of the hollow. Ashford Hollow looked like it had been preserved in amber, frozen sometime around 1950. The main street featured two-story brick buildings with large glass storefronts, their facades decorated with fading painted advertisements for products that Robert vaguely remembered from his childhood, brands that hadn't existed in decades. There was a drugstore with an actual soda fountain visible through the window, a five-and-dime store, a movie theater with a marquee that advertised films Robert had never heard of, and a gas station with old-fashioned pumps that displayed prices in cents rather than dollars. Robert pulled into the gas station, and the clicking noise from his engine immediately stopped. He sat there for a moment, looking around at the town with growing unease. The place looked real enough. The buildings were solid, the street was actual pavement, and he could see people moving around on the sidewalks, but something felt fundamentally wrong. The light was odd, too flat, like the difference between natural sunlight and fluorescent lighting, and the sounds were off. He could hear activity, doors opening and closing, distant conversations, the general ambient noise of a small town, but it all seemed muted, like he was hearing it through water or thick glass. An attendant emerged from the gas station, a young man who looked about 25, wearing a crisp white uniform and a cap with service embroidered across the front. He approached Robert's window with a bright smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Afternoon, sir. Fill her up," the attendant asked, his accent thick with Appalachian inflection but his cadence oddly stilted, like he was reciting lines from a script. "Actually, I was having some engine trouble," Robert said, climbing out of the car. "I heard a clicking noise and the car was losing power, but it seems to have stopped now." "Oh, that happens sometimes when folks come into the hollow," the attendant said, moving around to the front of the car. "Something about the elevation change, the air pressure, you know, cars adjust. She'll be fine now, but let me check under the hood just to be sure." Robert popped the hood release, and the attendant lifted it up, peering at the engine with the eye of someone who knew his way around automotive systems. But when Robert moved closer to look as well, he noticed something strange. The attendant wasn't really looking at the engine. His eyes were moving back and forth, scanning but not focusing, like someone pretending to read a book written in a language they didn't understand. "Everything looks fine to me," the attendant said after a moment, closing the hood with a metallic thunk. "You shouldn't have any more trouble. Will you be needing gas?" Robert checked his gauge. He was at about half a tank, which would be plenty to get him to Charleston. But something made him say yes, made him decide to stay in this odd little town just a bit longer. Curiosity, maybe, or the same instinct that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. The attendant filled the tank, and Robert noticed that the pump numbers spun slowly, almost hypnotically, and the final total came to exactly $20, which seemed impossibly cheap given modern gas prices. Robert handed over a $20 bill, and the attendant took it without offering change or asking if Robert wanted a receipt. "You folks here always get visitors?" Robert asked, trying to make conversation, trying to ground himself in normalcy. "Oh, from time to time," the attendant said. "People pass through, some stay a while, some leave. You planning on staying, sir?" "Just passing through," Robert said quickly. "I need to get to Charleston." "Charleston," the attendant repeated, and his smile widened unnaturally, showing too many teeth. "That's quite a ways from here. You'll want to have a bite to eat first, maybe rest a spell. The diner serves a real good meatloaf. Blue plate special today." Robert wasn't hungry, but he found himself nodding, found himself saying, "Maybe I'll do that. Where's the diner?" "Right down Main Street, can't miss it. Molly's Place. Tell them Earl sent you." Robert got back in his car and drove slowly down Main Street, passing the storefronts and examining the town more carefully now. The wrongness was more apparent the longer he looked. The people on the sidewalks moved oddly, their gaits just slightly off rhythm, like actors who hadn't quite mastered walking naturally. Their clothes were period appropriate for the 1950s aesthetic of the town, but they looked brand new, costumes rather than actual vintage clothing worn and faded by time. And when Robert looked directly at people's faces, they immediately turned away or walked into buildings, as if they didn't want to be seen clearly. Molly's Place Diner occupied a corner lot, a classic stainless steel dining car with red vinyl booths visible through the windows. Robert parked on went inside, a bell chiming above the door as he entered. The interior was immaculate, the chrome polished to a mirror shine, the checkered floor so clean it squeaked under his shoes. There were about a dozen people in the diner, sitting in booths or at the counter, but none of them looked up when Robert entered. They continued eating their meals, but Robert noticed that none of them were actually chewing. They just moved their forks from their plates to their mouths and back again in mechanical, repetitive motions. A waitress approached him, a woman in her 30s wearing a pink uniform with Molly embroidered on the chest. Her hair was done up in an elaborate style that must have required significant time and hairspray, and her makeup was applied with almost theatrical precision. "Sit anywhere you like, honey," she said, her voice cheerful but hollow. "Coffee?" "Sure, thank you," Robert said, sliding into a booth near the window where he could see his car. Molly brought him coffee in a thick ceramic mug, the kind that had been standard in American diners for generations. The coffee was hot and smelled normal, but when Robert tasted it, it was bland, flavorless, like drinking hot water with just a hint of coffee flavor added. "Earl said the meatloaf was good," Robert said, looking up at Molly. Her smile widened fractionally. "You know Earl, that's nice." "Earl's been here a long time. Everybody knows Earl. Meatloaf's real good today, comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. I'll get that for you." She walked away before Robert could say anything else, and he sat there sipping his flavorless coffee and watching the other diners. None of them spoke to each other, even the ones who were sitting together. They just performed the motions of eating over and over, their eyes staring at nothing. Robert pulled out his phone, thinking he'd check his GPS, maybe look up Ashford Hollow online and see what he could find about this strange place. But his phone showed no signal, which wasn't surprising in these mountain hollows, and when he tried to check his previously loaded maps, the app wouldn't open. The phone's clock showed 2:47 p.m., which seemed right. He'd entered the town around 2:30. Molly returned with his meal, a plate piled high with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all of it steaming and looking perfectly normal. But when Robert cut into the meatloaf with his fork, he noticed that the interior was the same color as the exterior, a uniform brown with no variation, no texture. He took a bite anyway, and like the coffee, it had almost no flavor. He could feel the substance in his mouth, could feel chewing and swallowing, but it tasted like nothing, like eating cardboard shaped like food. He pushed the plate away and stood up abruptly, intending to leave money on the table and get out of this place as quickly as possible. But when he looked toward the door, it was blocked. Not physically, no one stood in his way, but every time Robert tried to move toward the exit, he found himself turning around, found himself sitting back down, found his body refusing to obey his conscious desire to leave. "Something wrong with your meal, honey?" Molly asked, appearing beside his booth though Robert hadn't seen her approach. "I need to go," Robert said, hearing the panic creeping into his voice. "I need to get to Charleston." "Charleston," Molly repeated, and now her face changed, the features becoming less defined, more generic, like a drawing of a person rather than an actual person. "That's outside. You don't want to go outside. It's nice here, peaceful, safe. People stay here. They're happy here." Robert stood up again, and this time he forced himself toward the door, concentrating all his will on moving forward, on pushing through whatever invisible force was trying to keep him in this place. His body felt heavy, like he was moving through water, but he made progress, reaching the door and pushing it open. The bell chimed and Robert burst out onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath even though he hadn't been running. The people on the street had stopped moving entirely now. All of them turned toward him, their faces blank and terrible in their emptiness. And beyond them, past the last buildings of Ashford Hollow, Robert saw something that made his blood freeze. There was nothing there. No road leading out of town, no forest, no mountains. Just a gray blankness like static on a television screen, a void where reality should have been. Ashford Hollow wasn't a town in West Virginia. It was an island, a bubble, a trap suspended in nothingness. Robert ran for his car, fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. All around him, the townspeople were moving now, converging on him slowly, their blank faces turned in his direction. He got the door open, threw himself inside, and started the engine. It caught immediately, and Robert threw the car into drive and floored the accelerator. He aimed directly at the void, at that gray nothingness beyond the town limits, telling himself that it had to be an illusion, had to be his eyes playing tricks, had to be anything other than what it appeared to be. The townspeople were behind him now, running with that odd, shambling gait, and Molly was in front of the diner, screaming in a no longer sounded even remotely human. "Stay. You have to stay. Everyone stays." Robert's car hit the edge of the gray void and everything went white. He felt a sensation of falling, of being pulled apart and reassembled, of existing in multiple places simultaneously. The white light was absolute, erasing everything, and Robert screamed even though he couldn't hear his own voice. Then abruptly he was back on Route 60, the forest pressing close on both sides, autumn sunshine filtering through the trees. His car was moving at about 40 miles per hour and Robert slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a shuddering halt on the shoulder. He sat there for several minutes, breathing hard, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror. He checked his phone. The time was 3:03 p.m. and he had full signal. Only 16 minutes had passed since his engine had started making that clicking noise, though Robert would have sworn he'd spent at least an hour in that place. Robert pulled back onto the highway and drove straight to Charleston without stopping, even to use the restroom or get a drink. He completed his appointments the next day in a fog, barely able to concentrate, and as soon as he could, he drove straight back to Ohio, taking Interstate 64 the entire way and refusing to use any back roads or small highways. Over the following weeks, Robert searched online for any mention of Ashford Hollow, West Virginia. He found nothing. No census records, no historical references, no mentions in any book or article about West Virginia towns. He even contacted the West Virginia State Archives and the Department of Tourism, but no one had ever heard of a place called Ashford Hollow. Robert made another trip through West Virginia a month later, forcing himself to drive Route 60 in daylight, looking for the turnoff that had led to that impossible town. He found nothing. No sign, no turnoff, no indication that anything had ever been there. The road was just road, continuous and unbroken. But sometimes, late at night, Robert dreams that he's back in Molly's Place diner, eating flavorless meatloaf while the townspeople stare at him with their empty faces. And in the dreams, he never makes it back to his car. In the dreams, Molly's smile widens and widens until her face is nothing but smile and she says, "You'll stay now. Everyone stays. You'll be happy here." And Robert wakes up screaming, checking his surroundings frantically to make sure he's really in his bedroom in Columbus, really escaped from that place that exists where and everywhere, that waits in the spaces between real places, ready to trap anyone unfortunate enough to take the wrong turn at the wrong time on a lonely mountain road. Story 4. The Broadcast from Nowhere. Daniel Petrosky had been a ham radio enthusiast for 31 years, ever since his grandfather had introduced him to the hobby when he was 12 years old. Now 43 and working as an IT consultant, Daniel maintained an impressive amateur radio setup in the basement of his home in Kingsport, Tennessee, right on the edge of the Appalachian mountain range. His station included multiple transceivers, sophisticated antenna arrays, and enough equipment to communicate with operators around the world. He won awards for making contact with stations on all 7 continents and prided himself on his technical expertise and his ability to pull in even the weakest, most distant signals. But nothing in his 3 decades of experience prepared him for what he heard on the night of October 13, 2018, a transmission that came from somewhere that shouldn't exist, carrying a message that still haunts his dreams. It was just after midnight, and Daniel was in his basement shack, ham radio slang for an operator's workspace, attempting to make contact with a station in Japan. Propagation conditions had been excellent all evening, with the ionosphere bouncing signals across the Pacific with unusual clarity. Daniel was slowly scanning through frequencies on his Yaesu transceiver, listening to the characteristic sounds of shortwave radio, the warbling tones of digital modes, fragments of conversations in multiple languages, the steady beeping of weather stations, and the occasional burst of static. He was on 7.2 megahertz, a frequency in the 40-meter band that was popular among North American operators, when he heard something unusual. It started as a carrier wave, that steady tone that indicates someone is transmitting but not yet speaking, and then a voice emerged from the static. The signal strength was incredible, S9 plus 20 decibels on Daniel's meter, which indicated a very strong local signal, maybe someone transmitting from just a few miles away. But it was what the voice was saying that made Daniel sit up straight in his chair, his hand frozen on the tuning knob. This is Echo Charlie 777, broadcasting from Ravens Crossing, West Virginia. If anyone can hear this please respond. We need help. They're coming through now, and we don't know how much longer we can hold them back. This is Echo Charlie 777. Is anyone listening? The voice was male, young, probably in his 20s, and it was tight with barely controlled panic. Daniel immediately grabbed his microphone and keyed the transmit button. Echo Charlie 777, this is Kilo 4 Delta Bravo Charlie in Kingsport, Tennessee. I read you 5 by 9. What is the nature of your emergency? Over. There was a pause, filled with static and an odd undertone that Daniel couldn't quite identify, a low rhythmic sound like breathing or waves. Then the voice came back, and now Daniel could hear other sounds in the background. People shouting, something that might have been screaming, and a deep thrumming that made his radio's speaker vibrate. Kilo 4 Delta Bravo Charlie, thank God. We've been trying to reach someone for hours. Listen, I don't know how much time I have. We're in Ravens Crossing, about 40 miles northwest of Bluefield. There's something happening here, something that started 3 days ago. The cave opened and they started coming through. We thought we could control it, thought we could study it, but we were wrong. They're not from here, not from anywhere in this world. Please, you need to contact authorities, send help to... The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a burst of noise so loud that Daniel ripped his headphones off. The sound wasn't just audio. It felt physical, like pressure against his eardrums and behind his eyes. His radio's meter was pinned at maximum, indicating a signal so strong it was overloading his receiver. The speaker was emitting a sound that no radio transmission should be able to produce, a complex harmony of tone that seemed to create 3-dimensional patterns in the air, visual distortions that Daniel could see even with his eyes open. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The frequency was dead silent, not even the usual background static. Daniel's radio was still functioning. He could see the power light, the frequency display, all the normal indicators. But 7.2 megahertz was as quiet as if every radio transmitter in the world had simultaneously shut down. Daniel tried calling back to Echo Charlie 777, but there was no response. He switched to other frequencies, monitoring the standard emergency channels and calling nets, trying to find someone who might have heard the same transmission. But the other frequencies were normal, filled with the usual nighttime chatter of ham radio operators discussing antennas and propagation conditions and making routine contacts. No one mentioned any emergency broadcasts or unusual transmissions. Daniel spent the next hour trying to make sense of what he'd heard. He pulled up maps of West Virginia on his computer, searching for any town or location called Raven's Crossing. He found nothing. He searched FCC databases for the call sign Echo Charlie 777 and came up empty. The call sign didn't exist in any registry. He even posted on several amateur radio forums, asking if anyone else had heard the transmission, but all the responses were negative. By 2 in the morning, Daniel was beginning to doubt his own memory. Had he actually heard what he thought he'd heard? Could it have been some kind of hoax, maybe a pirate broadcaster playing elaborate pranks? But the signal had been too strong, too professional, and the fear in the operator's voice had been real. Daniel had heard plenty of distress calls over the years. Ham radio operators often assisted in emergency communications during disasters, and he knew the sound of genuine terror. He decided to investigate further. The voice had mentioned Bluefield, West Virginia, and said Raven's Crossing was about 40 miles northwest of there. Daniel pulled up Google Maps and started examining the area. It was rugged mountain country, heavily forested, with few roads and even fewer towns. Much of it was part of national forests or private land owned by coal companies. It was the kind of place where a small community could exist without appearing on maps, especially if it was an old settlement that had been abandoned when the coal industry collapsed. Over the next 3 days, Daniel became obsessed with finding Raven's Crossing. He took time off work, telling his boss he had family business to attend to, and drove to Bluefield. From there, he began systematically exploring the back roads and forest tracks northwest of the city, following old mining roads and trails that barely qualified as passable for his 4-wheel drive truck. The mountains in this area were particularly isolated, ridge after ridge of steep terrain covered in dense forest, broken by abandoned strip mines and coal processing facilities that had been left to rust and decay. Daniel saw no other vehicles for hours at a time, no signs of human habitation except for the occasional hunting camp or decrepit trailer. His GPS became increasingly unreliable as he pushed deeper into the mountains, the satellite signal blocked by the terrain and heavy tree cover. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Daniel was following a particularly rough track that wound up a narrow hollow between steep ridges. The track had once been paved. He could tell from the occasional chunks of ancient asphalt still visible beneath the dirt and vegetation, suggesting this had been a significant road at some point in the past. The hollow opened into a small valley, and that's where Daniel found it, Raven's Crossing, or what was left of it. The town was laid out in a grid pattern typical of coal company towns from the early 20th century. A main street with company store and administrative buildings, and several rows of identical houses on side streets. But every structure was abandoned, windows broken, roofs collapsed, walls covered in decades of vegetation. It looked like any of 100 other ghost towns scattered through Appalachia, communities that had thrived briefly during the coal boom, and then died when the mines closed and the people moved away. But there were differences. As Daniel walked through the town, his radio in hand and still tuned to 7.2 megahertz, he noticed things that didn't fit the usual pattern of abandonment and decay. Many of the buildings had been destroyed from the inside out, with walls blown outward and debris scattered in patterns that suggested explosive force. Others had strange markings on their walls, symbols carved or burned into the wood, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly because they seemed to violate basic rules of perspective and proportion. And there was the cave. It was at the far end of town, where the valley narrowed to a point against the base of a sheer cliff face. The entrance was enormous, at least 50 feet wide and 30 feet high, a perfectly circular opening that looked more like a tunnel than a natural cave. Daniel approached cautiously, his flashlight beam penetrating only a few feet into the absolute darkness beyond the entrance. The temperature around the cave was wrong. Despite it being a warm October afternoon, the air near the cave mouth was freezing, and Daniel could see his breath clouding in front of his face. And there was a sound coming from deep within, that same low thrumming he'd heard in the background of the radio transmission, rhythmic and somehow organic, like the heartbeat of something massive. Daniel keyed his radio microphone. "Echo Charlie 777, this is Kilo 4 Delta Bravo Charlie. I'm at Ravens Crossing. If you can hear me, please respond. Over." The radio emitted a burst of static, and then the same voice from 3 nights ago emerged from the speaker. But it sounded different now, distorted, layered with harmonics that made it difficult to understand. "Charlie Bravo shouldn't have come here. Too late for us. They're everywhere now. Can't tell what's real anymore. Cave goes down forever. Leads to somewhere else, somewhere wrong. What happened here?" Daniel transmitted. "Where are you? Where is everyone? Tried to study it, thought we could, but it changed us. Changed everything. They came through and they're still here, hiding in the spaces, in the gaps. Can you see them? Look at the shadows. Look at what moves when you're not looking directly at it." Daniel spun around, examining the abandoned buildings, the overgrown streets, the surrounding forest. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the shadows. They were wrong, cast at angles that didn't match the position of the sun. And they were moving, flowing like liquid, pooling in doorways and behind walls. As Daniel watched, one of the shadows detached itself from beneath a collapsed porch and began moving toward him, sliding across the ground in defiance of every law of physics. "Oh God," Daniel whispered, backing away from the approaching shadow. What is this place?" The voice on the radio laughed, a sound devoid of any humor, layered and echoing. "This place, it's nowhere and everywhere. It's what's underneath." The cave opened something, broke a seal that was meant to stay closed. And now Ravens Crossing exists in 2 places at once. We're still here, the ones who didn't escape. We're in the spaces between. And now you're here too. Now you've seen. Now they know about you. More shadows were moving now, emerging from buildings and trees, flowing together and taking shapes that approximated human form but were fundamentally wrong. They had too many limbs or not enough, and they moved with a liquid grace that was profoundly disturbing. And the thrumming from the cave was getting louder, resonating in Daniel's chest, making his heart beat irregularly. Daniel ran. He didn't try to get closer to the cave, didn't attempt to investigate further or document what he was seeing. He simply ran back to his truck, the shadows flowing after him, reaching for him with appendages that were there one moment and gone the next. He threw himself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and gunned it down the deteriorating road, not caring about the damage to his vehicle, caring only about getting away from that place. The shadows pursued him for almost a mile, visible in his rearview mirror as dark shapes that moved faster than should be possible, flowing over and through obstacles. Then, as Daniel reached the point where it opened onto a wider valley, the shadows stopped abruptly, as if they'd hit an invisible barrier. They pooled at the edge of the valley, writhing and reaching, but unable or unwilling to proceed further. Daniel drove straight back to Kingsport, a 6-hour journey that he completed in just over 4 hours, stopping only once for gas and not even going inside the station to pay, using the card reader at the pump and keeping his eyes fixed on the surrounding area, watching for shadows that moved wrong. When he got home, he went straight to his radio shack and turned on his equipment. He tuned to 7.2 megahertz and listened. The frequency was active with normal traffic, operators making routine contacts. But at exactly midnight, the frequency went silent and the voice came through again. Kilo 4 Delta Bravo Charlie. You came. You saw, now you're connected, now you're part of it. You'll hear us every night now. Every night at midnight we're still here, still trapped between, and we're so lonely, so very lonely. Would you like to join us? Would you like to see what's beneath? The cave is always open, always waiting. You know where to find us. Daniel shut off his radio and unplugged it. Then he went around his house and unplugged every electronic device, his television, his computer, his phone, anything that could potentially receive a signal. But he could still hear the voice, faint but persistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere, whispering about the cave and the spaces between and what waits in the dark beneath the mountains. He sold his house 2 months later and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, as far from Appalachia as he could get while staying in the continental United States. He never operated a ham radio again, couldn't bring himself to even tune across the shortwave bands. But every night at midnight, no matter where he is or what he's doing, Daniel hears that voice whispering in the back of his mind, calling to him, inviting him back to Raven's Crossing, to the cave that leads down and down into spaces that should not exist, where the people who were caught in the experiment still exist in some horrible in-between state, trapped forever in the gaps between reality, broadcasting their eternal plea for rescue or company, or perhaps just acknowledgement that they still exist in some form, somewhere in the dark beneath the ancient mountains. Story 5. The Wrong Turn Road. Jessica Hartwell loved her evening runs through the mountain trails near her home in Boone, North Carolina. The 29-year-old graphic designer had moved to the area 2 years earlier, drawn by the stunning beauty of the Blue Mountains and the outdoor lifestyle that the region offered. She ran 5 days a week, typically covering 6 to 8 miles on the network of trails that crisscrossed the national forest land just outside of town. She was fit, experienced, and careful, always telling her roommate exactly which trail she planned to run and what time to expect her back. She carried her phone, pepper spray, and a whistle, and she'd never had any problems more serious than an occasional encounter with a curious black bear or an aggressive turkey. On the evening of March 17, 2022, Jessica set out for what should have been a routine 6-mile loop on the Boone Fork Trail, a popular route that followed a creek through hardwood forest before climbing to a ridge with spectacular views. She left her car at the trailhead parking lot at 5:30 p.m., planning to be back before dark at around 7:15. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with clear skies and that particular quality of light that comes in early spring when the sun is getting stronger, but the trees haven't yet leafed out completely. The first 4 miles of the run were completely normal. Jessica maintained her usual pace, enjoying the sound of the creek beside the trail and the first signs of spring in the wildflowers beginning to bloom in sunny spots. She passed several other hikers and trail runners, exchanging friendly greetings as was customary on these trails. Everything was exactly as it should be, familiar and comfortable. The trouble started at the junction where the Boone Fork Trail intersected with a spur trail that led up to a ridge overlook. Jessica had been to this junction dozens of times and knew it well. The main trail continued straight, following the creek, while the spur trail branched to the right and climbed steeply uphill. But when Jessica reached the junction on this particular evening, there was a third trail she'd never seen before. It branched to the left, descending gradually into a part of the hollow she didn't recognize. The trail looked old but well-maintained, the path clear and the edges neatly defined. There was even a trail marker, a small wooden sign with a blue blaze painted on it, indicating this was an official trail. But Jessica had hiked and run this area extensively, had studied the trail maps, and she was certain this trail hadn't existed before. She stopped and pulled out her phone to check the map app she used for navigation. But her phone showed no service, which was unusual this close to town, and the GPS wasn't updating her location. The blue dot that her position was frozen at a point about half a mile back on the trail, and no matter how long she waited, it wouldn't refresh. Jessica knew she should turn around, head back the way she'd come, and stick to the familiar trail. But she was curious, and the mysterious trail seemed to be heading in the general direction she wanted to go. She convinced herself that it was probably a new trail that had been cut recently, maybe a reroute to avoid erosion on an older section. She'd just run down it a little way, see where it led, and if it didn't connect back to familiar territory within a mile or so, she'd turn back. She started down the new trail at an easy pace, alert for any signs that would tell her where she was. The forest on either side looked normal enough, typical second-growth hardwoods with the usual understory of rhododendron and mountain laurel. But as Jessica continued, she began to notice small inconsistencies. The trees seemed to be getting larger, older, the kind of old-growth timber that had been logged out of these mountains a century ago. And the light was changing, becoming dimmer even though it shouldn't be sunset yet, as if she was running into deeper shadow. After about 10 minutes, Jessica came around a bend and found herself on a dirt road. Not a trail, but an actual road, wide enough for a vehicle, with gravel surface and drainage ditches on either side. This was definitely wrong. There were no roads in this part of the national forest, at least not according to any map Jessica had ever seen. The road ran perpendicular to the trail she'd been on, heading off into the dimming forest in both directions. Jessica stopped and turned around, intending to retrace her steps back to the familiar junction. But the trail she'd just been running on was gone. Where it should have been, there was only unbroken forest, thick undergrowth with no sign of any path or disturbance. Jessica pushed into the brush, searching for the trail, but there was nothing. It was as if the trail had simply ceased to exist the moment she'd stepped onto the road. Fighting down panic, Jessica pulled out her phone again. Still no service, and now the battery indicator showed only 15% remaining even though she'd started with a full charge. She opened her compass app, one of the few that worked without cell service, and determined that the road ran roughly east-west. Boone was to the north, so if she could find a way off this road and head north through the forest, she should eventually hit civilization. But something made her hesitate to plunge into the forest. The trees seemed different now, wrong somehow, their trunks and their bark too smooth. And it was getting dark fast, much faster than it should. The sun shouldn't set for at least another hour, but the light was fading as if it were already twilight. Jessica decided to follow the road west, reasoning that roads had to lead somewhere, had to connect to other roads eventually. She started jogging, keeping a steady pace despite her growing anxiety. The road stretched ahead of her, perfectly straight, disappearing into the gathering darkness. After about 10 minutes of running, Jessica noticed something that made her slow down and then stop completely. She just passed a distinctive tree, a massive oak with a prominent burl on its trunk that looked almost like a human face. She was certain she hadn't seen it before, which was good. It meant she was making progress, covering new ground. But then, 50 yards further down the road, she saw another tree with an identical burl, in exactly the same position on the trunk. Jessica walked up to the second tree and examined it closely. The details matched perfectly, down to the pattern of the bark and the shape of the face-like growth. Either there were two trees with impossibly identical features, or she had somehow circled back to the same tree. But that was impossible. The road was straight and she'd been running in a constant direction. She continued forward, past the second tree, and counted her steps. 200 paces, then 300, then 400. At 500 paces, she saw the tree again. Same oak, same burl, same position relative to the road. Jessica was somehow running in a loop on a perfectly straight road, passing the same landmark over and over even though that violated every law of geometry and physics. She turned around and ran in the opposite direction, back toward the east. Surely going the other way would break whatever strange phenomenon was happening. She ran hard now, sprinting, desperate to find some variation, some sign that she was making progress. But at roughly 500 paces, she passed the tree again, then again, and again. The light was almost gone now, true darkness settling over the forest, and Jessica's phone was down to 5% battery. She turned on the flashlight function, knowing it would drain the battery quickly, but needing the light more than she needed the false security of a non-functional phone. In the narrow beam of the flashlight, the road looked different. The gravel was darker, almost black, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And there were marks on the surface now, patterns and symbols that Jessica was certain hadn't been there before, geometric that hurt her eyes when she tried to focus on them. Then she heard the footsteps. They were behind her, the sound of someone walking on the gravel road, steady and deliberate. Jessica spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but she saw no one. The footsteps continued, getting closer, but the road was empty. She backed away, her light sweeping back and forth, and that's when she saw the shadows. They were moving wrong, flowing across the road's surface independent of any light source, gathering and coalescing into forms that were almost human-shaped but not quite. They moved toward Jessica from both directions, cutting off any escape route along the road. The footsteps were louder now, echoing weirdly, coming from multiple directions at once. Jessica did the only thing she could think of. She ran directly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth, branches whipping at her face and arms. Behind her, she could hear sounds of pursuit, not footsteps now, but something that sounded like wind rushing through hollow spaces, like breathing that came from everywhere and nowhere. The forest was absolutely dark, her flashlight beam barely penetrating a few feet ahead. Jessica had no idea which direction she was running, no sense of north or south or any landmark to guide her. She just ran, driven by pure terror, expecting at any moment to be grabbed by those flowing shadows or whatever made the breathing sounds that pursued her. She ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and then suddenly she was falling. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and Jessica tumbled down a steep slope, rolling and sliding, unable to stop herself. She hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her and sending her phone flying into the darkness. Jessica lay there, gasping for breath, every part of her body screaming with pain. She could hear water nearby, a stream or creek, and that sound was somehow reassuring, something normal and natural in this nightmare. She forced herself to stand, testing her limbs. Nothing seemed to be broken, though she was scraped and bruised and would feel this for days. Without her phone's light, the darkness was absolute. Jessica felt her way carefully toward the sound of water, her hands outstretched, moving slowly to avoid running into trees or falling again. She reached the stream, felt the cold water flowing over her hands, and followed it downstream, reasoning that water flows downhill and eventually reaches civilization. She walked for a long time, losing track of minutes and hours, following the stream by sound and feel. The darkness seemed to be lifting, and Jessica realized with enormous relief that dawn was coming. As the light grew stronger, she could make out her surroundings. She was in a steep-sided hollow, following a creek that tumbled over rocks and fallen logs. The forest around her looked normal, familiar, like the mountains she knew. The hollow widened, and Jessica saw a trail ahead, a proper hiking trail with wooden steps and a hand railing. She climbed up to the trail and saw a sign, Boone Fork Trail parking 2.5 miles. She was back on familiar ground, back in the normal world. Jessica ran the remaining distance to the parking lot, emerging into bright morning sunlight. Her car was where she'd left it, and there were several other vehicles in the lot, hikers preparing for early morning treks. Jessica checked her watch and felt her stomach drop. It was 7:45 a.m. on March 18th. She'd been missing for over 14 hours. Her phone was gone, lost somewhere in that impossible forest. But when she got home and checked her computer, she found dozens of messages from her roommate, her family, and the sheriff's department. A search had been organized when she didn't return the previous evening, with teams out looking for her throughout the night. Jessica called them off, claiming she'd gotten lost and disoriented, had spent the night in the forest, and found her way back in the morning. But that wasn't the truth. Jessica had spent maybe 2 hours in that place, on that road that looped impossibly back on itself, pursued by shadows that moved wrong. The missing 12 hours were just gone, erased, and Jessica has no memory of where she was or what happened during that time. She never runs alone anymore, and never on trails she doesn't know absolutely well. She stays in open areas where she can always see civilization, where she can't take a wrong turn and find herself on roads that shouldn't exist, roads that loop back on themselves in violation of all natural law, roads patrolled by things that look like shadows but move with terrible purpose and intelligence. Because Jessica knows now that there are spaces in the Appalachian Mountains where the normal rules don't apply, where you can step from the familiar world into somewhere else with a single wrong turn, and where time moves differently or doesn't move at all, and where the things that live there are always waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble onto their road and join the others who took the wrong turn and never found their way back to the world they knew. Story 6. The Breathing Mine. Thomas Garrett had spent 42 years working in and around the coal mines of southern West Virginia, seen everything the mountains had to offer, both beautiful and terrible. The 65-year-old mine safety inspector had survived 2 major collapses, countless smaller accidents, and the slow economic death of the industry that had sustained his family for 4 generations. He'd explored hundreds of mines, from modern operations with state-of-the-art equipment to century-old workings that existed only as black holes in hillsides, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But in all those years, in all those dark tunnels carved into the ancient stone, Thomas had never encountered anything like what he found in the Blackwood mine on October 28, 2019. The Blackwood mine had been abandoned in 1957, closed when the seam played out, and the company moved operations to a more productive area. It was located deep in the hills northeast of Logan, accessible only by a logging road that was barely maintained and often impassable during wet weather. The mine wasn't particularly large or historically significant, and under normal circumstances, Thomas would have had no reason to inspect it. But the state had received reports from hikers and hunters of strange sounds coming from the mine entrance, along with concerns about possible structural instability that could cause a collapse and damage the watershed. Thomas made the drive out to the mine on a Thursday afternoon, navigating his pickup truck carefully along the rutted logging road. The weather was typical for late October in the mountains, cool and overcast, with a damp mist that clung to the hollows and made everything look gray and indistinct. The forest was in that transitional state between autumn and winter, most of the leaves already fallen, the trees bare black skeletons against the gray sky. The mine entrance was exactly where the old maps indicated it would be, a horizontal opening about 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, carved into the base of a steep hillside. Like most drift mines in this region, it went straight into the mountain, following a coal seam that angled slightly upward. A rusted mine car sat on rails just inside the entrance, and the wooden supports near the opening were rotting and collapsed in places, but the main tunnel appeared to be in reasonable condition, at least from what Thomas could see from the outside. He parked his truck, gathered his equipment, a powerful LED headlamp, a handheld spotlight, a gas detector to check for methane and carbon monoxide, a tape measure, and a camera to document, and approached the entrance. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. Air was flowing out of the mine, and it was warm, surprisingly so for late October. Mine air was usually cool and constant, maintaining the average temperature of the deep earth, which in this region was around 55 degrees. But the air coming from the Blackwood mine felt closer to 80 or 90 degrees, and it had an unusual smell, organic and slightly sweet, like vegetation decomposing in a hot, closed space. Thomas checked his gas detector. The readings were normal, no dangerous accumulations of methane or carbon monoxide, oxygen levels adequate. But there was something odd about the air flow. It wasn't constant but pulsing, rhythmic, like the mine was breathing. Thomas had encountered this phenomenon before in mines with multiple openings, where air pressure differences created a flow that could fluctuate. But the rhythm of this was too regular, too organic. It really did sound and feel like breathing. 3 seconds of outflow, 1 second pause, 3 seconds of inflow, 1 second pause, over and over. Thomas stood at the entrance for several minutes, documenting the condition of the supports and the opening, taking photographs and measurements. The whole time, he listened to that rhythmic breathing, and something about it made him profoundly uneasy. He'd spent his entire adult life working in mines, was completely comfortable in underground spaces, could navigate through darkness and confined passages without any hint of claustrophobia or fear. But standing at the entrance to the Blackwood mine, feeling that warm, pulsing breath on his face, Thomas felt something he'd rarely experienced in his career, an overwhelming urge to turn around and leave. He ignored the feeling. He was a professional with a job to do and a responsibility to provide an accurate assessment of the mine's condition. He switched on his headlamp, activated his spotlight, and entered the mine. The main tunnel was larger than it appeared from outside, widening to about 8 feet across and 9 feet high after the first 50 feet. The roof was supported by wooden timbers, most of them in surprisingly good condition given the age of the mine. The floor was relatively level, covered in a layer of coal dust and scattered debris, fragments of timber, pieces of rusted metal from old equipment, and the ubiquitous mine rails that ran down the center of the tunnel. Thomas walked slowly, examining the roof and ribs, the sides of the tunnel for any signs of instability. Every 100 feet or so, he stopped to take photographs. The breathing rhythm was more pronounced inside the mine, and Thomas could feel it as well as hear it, a pressure change that made his ears pop slightly with each cycle. About 300 feet into the mine, Thomas encountered the first side passage. It was narrower than the main tunnel, maybe 5 feet wide, and it angled off to the right, descending slightly. According to the maps Thomas had reviewed, the Blackwood mine was supposed to be a simple drift mine with one main tunnel and no significant side workings. But here was a passage that didn't appear on any map. Thomas shone his spotlight down the side passage. The beam penetrated about 30 feet before the tunnel curved, and the light was absorbed by the darkness. The warm air was definitely flowing from this direction, and the breathing rhythm was stronger here, more pronounced. Thomas made a note of the passage's location and continued down the main tunnel, intending to map the entire main working before exploring any side passages. But over the next 200 feet, Thomas encountered 5 more side passages, none of them shown on the mine maps, all of them on the right side of the main tunnel, all descending at approximately the same angle, and all of them exhaling that warm, strangely organic-smelling air. Thomas's unease deepened. The existence of unmapped workings wasn't particularly unusual. Mine maps were often incomplete or inaccurate, especially for older operations, but something about these passages bothered him. They were too regular, too uniform, spaced at almost exactly 50-foot intervals and all heading in the same direction, as if they were leading to something. At about 800 feet into the mine, The main tunnel ended abruptly at a blank coal face, the point where the seam had played out or become too thin to economically extract. This should have been the end of the mine, but Thomas's measurements told him something was wrong. According to the maps and his calculations, he should have traveled at least 1,200 feet to reach the end of the known workings. He was coming up 400 feet short. Thomas examined the coal face closely with his spotlight and spotted something that made his skin crawl. The face wasn't natural, wasn't the rough, broken surface you'd expect from the end of mining operations. Instead, it was smooth, almost polished, and there were marks on it, regular grooves that formed patterns. Thomas recognized some of them as tool marks from picks and drills, but others were different, organic-looking, like something had been scratching or clawing at the coal from the other side. And there was something. In the exact center of the coal face, at about chest height, was a hole. It was perfectly circular, about 4 inches in diameter, and it went straight into the coal. Thomas couldn't see how deep it went, but when he held his hand near the opening, he felt the breathing more strongly than anywhere else in the mine. The warm air was exhaling directly from this hole, and during the inhalation phase, he could feel it pulling, creating a slight suction. Thomas pulled out his camera to photograph the hole, and that's when he heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, felt more than heard, coming from deep within the mine, from somewhere beyond the coal face. The rumbling built quickly, and the breathing rhythm changed, accelerating, becoming faster and more forceful. The warm air flowing from the passages and the hole began to feel hot, almost uncomfortably so, and the smell intensified, becoming less sweet and more rot, like something dead and decaying. Then Thomas heard the voices. They were distant and echoing, coming from the side passages, and at first he thought they might be other people, maybe hikers who'd entered the mine from another opening. But as he listened, Thomas realized the voices weren't speaking any language he recognized. They were making sounds that might have been words, but the phonemes were wrong, the rhythms and cadences unlike any human speech. And there were too many of them, dozens of voices overlapping, all calling or chanting in unison. Thomas backed away from the coal face, his spotlight sweeping across the tunnel walls, and saw something that made him question his sanity. The side passages were no longer empty. There were figures in them, barely visible in the darkness, standing just beyond the reach of his light. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong in ways Thomas couldn't quite articulate. Too tall and too thin, with proportions that didn't match any living person. And they were swaying, all of them moving in rhythm with the breathing of the mine, their movements synchronized perfectly. The figures began to move forward, emerging from the side passages into the main tunnel. Thomas turned and ran. He was 65 years old and not in the best shape anymore, but fear gave him speed he hadn't possessed in decades. He ran back toward the entrance, his spotlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating brief glimpses of the tunnel walls and roof and the rails on the floor. Behind him, he could hear the figures following, their footsteps, if they were footsteps, making a sound like dry leaves rustling or bones clicking together. And the voices were louder now, the strange, inhuman chanting echoing through the tunnel, bouncing off the wall, harmonics that seemed to vibrate in Thomas's chest and skull. The breathing of the mine had changed completely, no longer rhythmic but chaotic, gasping and wheezing like an asthmatic having an attack. The warm air became hot wind, almost scorching, and the smell was overpowering now, a stench of decay and corruption that made Thomas gag as he ran. He could see the entrance ahead, a gray circle of daylight that looked impossibly far away. Thomas pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the stabbing pain in his knees. The figures were right behind him now. He could feel them, could sense their presence even without looking back, and he knew with absolute certainty that if they caught him, something terrible would happen, something worse than death. Thomas burst out of the mine entrance and sprawled onto the ground, gasping for breath. He rolled over and looked back at the tunnel opening, expecting to see the figures emerging, but they weren't there. The mine entrance was empty, and the breathing had stopped. The air was still and cool, perfectly normal October afternoon air, and there was no sound coming from the mine at all. Thomas lay there for several minutes, trying to slow his racing heart and make sense of what had happened. Had he hallucinated? Experienced some kind of gas-induced delusion despite his detector showing normal readings? But his camera was still in his hand, and when he checked the display, he saw that he had successfully photographed the strange hole in the coal face. The image showed the perfectly circular opening, and in the darkness beyond, barely visible, there were shapes that might have been the figures he'd seen, or might have been shadows and tricks of light. Thomas got to his feet and walked back to his truck on shaking legs. He drove back to Logan, went directly to the state mine safety office, and filed his report. He documented the structural condition of the mine entrance, noted the presence of unmapped side passages, and recommended that the entrance be permanently sealed for public safety reasons. He didn't mention the breathing, or the heat, or the voices, or the figures. He simply stated that the mine showed signs of instability and unusual airflow patterns that warranted immediate closure. The state accepted his recommendation, and within 2 weeks, the Blackwood mine entrance was sealed with concrete and steel, a permanent barrier that would prevent anyone from entering. Thomas retired 6 months later, earlier than he'd planned, and moved to Charleston, where he bought a small house in a suburban neighborhood, as far from the mountains and mines as he could get while staying in West Virginia. But didn't bring peace. Thomas found himself obsessing over what he'd seen and experienced in the Blackwood mine. He spent hours researching the mine's history, trying to find some explanation for the unmapped passages and the strange phenomena. What he discovered unsettled him even further. The Blackwood mine had been opened in 1923 by a small independent coal company. For the first 10 years, it operated normally, producing modest but steady amounts of coal. But in 1933, there had been an incident. The details were sparse in the historical records, but apparently the miners had broken through into something. A natural cave system, according to the official reports, though the descriptions didn't quite make sense. Production stopped for 3 months while the company addressed geological concerns, and when the mine reopened, the workforce had changed completely. All the original miners had been let go or had quit, and an entirely new crew was brought in, men from outside the area who didn't talk about what they were doing underground. The mine operated for another 24 years with this new crew, but there were persistent rumors among the local population of strange things happening at the Blackwood. People reported seeing lights in the hills near the mine at night, hearing sounds like chanting or singing, and finding animals dead near the mine entrance, not killed by predators but simply dead, their bodies unmarked but drained of all blood. When the mine finally closed in 1957, it was done suddenly, with no advance notice. The crew simply walked off the job one day and never came back, and the company sealed the mine and abandoned all their equipment inside. Thomas found one more piece of information that made the situation even more disturbing. The coal seam that the Blackwood mine followed extended for several miles through the mountain range, and there had been 6 other mines on the same seam. All of them opened at different times between 1920 and 1955, and all of them had closed suddenly, in the same way as the Blackwood, with crews abandoning the workings and companies sealing the entrances immediately. The official reasons varied: seam exhaustion, economic conditions, labor issues, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Thomas tried to convince himself that there must be a rational explanation, that he'd experienced some kind of hallucination or misinterpreted natural phenomena. But he couldn't shake the memory of those figures, those impossible beings standing in the side passages, in rhythm with the breathing of the mine. And he couldn't forget the hole in the coal face, that perfect circle leading to somewhere unknown, exhaling warm air that smelled of decay and things that should stay buried. On cold nights, Thomas lies awake and thinks about what might be on the other side of that sealed coal face, in the spaces that the miners broke into in 1933 and tried to hide with their new workings and their secrets. He thinks about the breathing, that organic rhythm that suggested something massive and alive, something that exists in the spaces carved out beneath the mountains. And he wonders if sealing the entrance was enough, or if there are other ways in, other openings that lead to that place where the figures wait in darkness, swaying and chanting in languages that humans should never hear. Sometimes, late at night, Thomas hears the breathing. It comes from nowhere, not from any vent or pipe or external source, but from the air itself, from the space around him. 3 seconds of exhalation, 1 second pause, 3 seconds of inhalation, 1 second pause. The rhythm of something vast and patient, something that has waited beneath the mountains for longer than humans have existed, and which will continue waiting long after they're gone, breathing in the darkness, calling with voices that aren't voices, waiting for the next person to break through the thin barrier of stone and coal that separates our world from whatever realm they inhabit. In minds that connect to passages that lead down and down into the breathing darkness where time moves differently and the figures sway in their eternal dance. Story 7. The Family O.N. Ridge Road. Caitlin Morrison was driving through the mountains of eastern Tennessee on a drizzly evening in early November 2021, making her way from Knoxville to her parents' home in Virginia for the Thanksgiving holiday. The 34-year-old middle school teacher had made this drive dozens of times, usually taking Interstate 81 for its speed and convenience. But this year, she decided to take the scenic route through the smaller highways and back roads that wound through the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, wanting to enjoy the autumn scenery and take a break from the stress of her teaching job and a relationship that had recently ended badly. The drive had been pleasant through the afternoon, the mountain roads winding through forests of oak and maple still clinging to their autumn colors, past small towns and isolated homesteads. But as evening approached and the light began to fade, she found herself on increasingly remote roads, following her GPS through areas where cell service was spotty and other vehicles were rare. The drizzle had intensified into a steady cold rain, and fog was beginning to settle into the hollows, making visibility poor. Around 6:30, as full darkness fell, Caitlin's GPS directed her to turn onto what it identified as Ridge Road, a route that would supposedly cut 20 miles off her journey and bring her back to a larger highway. The turn was unmarked except for a small, weathered sign that confirmed the road name, and Caitlin hesitated before turning. Ridge Road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and it immediately began climbing steeply up the side of a mountain. But the GPS showed it as a through road, and Caitlin trusted her technology, so she made the turn and began the climb. The road wound back and forth in tight switchbacks, climbing steadily. The forest pressed close on both sides, and the rain was coming down harder now, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. Caitlin's headlights barely penetrated the curtain of rain and fog, illuminating only the next 20 feet of narrow pavement. She'd seen no other vehicles since turning onto Ridge Road, no lights from houses, no signs of human presence at all. After about 15 minutes of climbing, the road leveled out, apparently following the ridge crest that gave it its name. Visibility improved slightly as Caitlin drove above the worst of the fog, though the rain continued steady and cold. She was starting to relax, thinking the worst of the drive was behind her, when her headlights illuminated something ahead that made her slow down. A car was parked on the shoulder, a late model SUV with its hazard lights flashing. Next to the car stood a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy who looked about 10 and a girl who appeared to be 7 or 8. They were standing in the rain, apparently waiting for help, and as Caitlin approached, the man stepped toward the road and waved his arms, signaling for her to stop. Caitlin pulled over behind the SUV and rolled down her passenger window a few inches, enough to talk but maintaining some barrier. The man approached her window, his face appearing in the glow of her interior lights. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing jeans and a light jacket that was soaked through, his hair plastered to his head by the rain. "Thank God someone stopped," the man said, his voice tight with stress and relief. "Our car broke down about an hour ago. We've been trying to call for help, but there's no cell service. Could you possibly give us a ride? Just to the next town, somewhere we can get a tow truck and a hotel for the night." Caitlin looked past the man at the family standing by the SUV. The woman was holding the little girl, both of them shivering in the cold rain, while the boy stood next to his father, looking miserable and frightened. Caitlin's teacher instincts kicked in. Those children needed to get out of the rain and into somewhere warm and dry. But another part of her, a part conditioned by years of warnings about helping strangers on isolated roads, held her back. "I'd like to help," Caitlin said, "but I don't have a lot of room in my car. I've got all my luggage in the back seat." "Please," the man said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice now. "We've been standing out here in the cold for over an hour. My daughter's not dressed warmly enough. We just need to get somewhere with phone service, somewhere we can call for help. It's not safe for them to be out here in this weather." Caitlin made a decision. She popped her trunk and got out of the car, helping the man transfer some of her luggage from the back seat to the trunk to make room for the family. The woman and children climbed into the back seat while the man got in the front passenger seat. They were all soaked and cold, water dripping from their clothes onto Caitlin's seats, but she didn't care. She could dry out the car later. Right now, getting these people to safety was more important. "Thank you so much," the woman said from the back seat, her voice warm with gratitude. "I'm Claire and this is my husband Mark. These are our kids, Tyler and Emma." "I'm Caitlin," Caitlin said, putting the car in gear and pulling back onto the road. "How long have you been broken down?" "About an hour and a half," Mark said. "The engine just died, no warning. I tried to restart it, but nothing. We called for help, but like I said, no cell service. We were starting to think no one would come along. This road doesn't get much traffic." "What were you doing way out here?" Caitlin asked, making conversation as she drove, her windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the rain. "Taking the scenic route," Claire said with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. "We're heading home to North Carolina from a visit to family in Kentucky. Wanted to show the kids the mountains. Didn't expect to get stranded." They drove in silence for a few minutes, and Caitlin began to notice things that troubled her. The family's clothes, while wet, didn't look or smell like they'd been standing in the rain for an hour and a half. They should have been soaked through, water pooling on the seats, the smell of wet fabric filling the car. But their clothes seemed only damp, as if they'd been in the rain for just a few minutes. And the children, despite supposedly being cold and miserable, weren't shivering. They sat perfectly still in the back seat, not fidgeting or complaining the way children normally would. Caitlin glanced in her rearview mirror at the children. Emma, the little girl, was staring directly at her, her eyes reflecting the dashboard lights in a way that seemed wrong, too bright, like an animal's eyes catching light at night. When Caitlin's eyes met hers in the mirror, the girl smiled, and Caitlin saw that her teeth were too sharp, the canines elongated and pointed. Caitlin jerked her attention back to the road, her heart suddenly pounding. She must have imagined it, a trick of the light and the stress of driving in bad weather. But when she glanced in the mirror again, both children were staring at her with that same eerie intensity, their eyes gleaming, their smiles too wide and showing too many teeth. "How much farther to the next town?" Caitlin asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, not far now," Mark said from the passenger seat, and when Caitlin glanced at him, she saw that he was staring at her too, his head turned at an uncomfortable angle, his smile matching his children's, too wide, too many teeth, teeth that were too sharp. Actually, Mark continued, his voice changing, becoming layered with harmonics that hurt Caitlin's ears. We don't need to go to a town. You can just pull over here. We'd like to thank you properly for your kindness. No, Caitlin said, gripping the steering wheel tighter and pressing down on the accelerator. I think I'll just keep driving until we reach. Hands grabbed her shoulders from behind, and Caitlin screamed. Claire had leaned forward from the back seat, her grip impossibly strong, fingers digging into Caitlin's flesh even through her jacket. In the rearview mirror, Caitlin could see Claire's face, and it was no longer remotely human. The features were melting, shifting, revealing something beneath that looked like it was made of shadows and sharp angles and too many eyes. Mark reached for the steering wheel, trying to force Caitlin to pull over, but she fought him, wrestling for control of the car. The vehicle swerved across the narrow road, and Caitlin caught a glimpse of the edge, a steep drop off into darkness, no guardrail to prevent a plunge into the forest below. Let go of me, Caitlin shouted, and she did something desperate and dangerous. She slammed on the brakes while jerking the steering wheel hard to the right. The car's anti-lock brakes engaged, the vehicle slewing sideways on the wet pavement. Mark was thrown forward into the dashboard, his grip on the steering wheel broken, and Claire's hands lost their hold on Caitlin's shoulders. In the confusion, Caitlin found the door handle and threw herself out of the car while it was still sliding. She hit the pavement hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs, and rolled several times before coming to a stop at the edge of the road. Her car continued sliding and came to rest at an angle, the front end hanging over the drop-off, rear wheels still on the pavement. Caitlin scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't think about where she was going, didn't consider that she was running into unfamiliar forest in complete darkness during a rainstorm. She just ran, driven by pure terror, knowing that whatever those things in her car were, they weren't human, weren't anything that should exist in the natural world. Behind her, she heard car doors opening and sounds that might have been voices, or might have been animal calls, or might have been something else entirely, something for which there were no words in human language. Caitlin plunged into the forest, branches whipping at her face and arms, roots trying to trip her, but she didn't slow down. She ran for perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours, until exhaustion and the darkness forced her to stop. She moved away from the road, down the side of the ridge, and now she had no idea where she was. The forest was absolutely dark, the rain still falling steadily, and Caitlin was completely lost. But at least she couldn't hear pursuit anymore. Caitlin pulled out her phone, hoping for service or at least to use the flashlight function, but the phone was dead, the screen black and unresponsive. It had been fully charged when she'd picked up the family, but now it was completely drained, as if something had sucked all the power from it. She stood there in the darkness, shivering with cold and shock, trying to decide what to do. She couldn't stay here. Exposure would kill her if those things didn't find her first. She needed to get back to the road, but not to where her car was. She needed to find help, find other people, find somewhere safe. Caitlin started walking, trying to move parallel to the ridge, figuring that eventually she'd intersect with the road either ahead of or behind where she'd left her car. The terrain was steep and treacherous, and she fell several times, scraping her hands and knees on rocks and roots. But she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that staying still meant death, either from exposure or from whatever those things were that had disguised themselves as a stranded family. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Caitlin saw lights ahead through the trees. Not headlights or flashlights, but the warm yellow glow of windows in buildings. She moved toward the lights, emerging from the forest onto a paved road. Not Ridge Road, but a wider highway with painted lines and reflective markers. Across the highway was a truck stop, a glowing oasis of fluorescent light and normalcy. Caitlin stumbled across the road and into the truck stop, where several drivers sat at tables eating late dinners. She must have looked like a wild woman, soaked and muddy and bleeding from numerous cuts and scrapes, because conversation stopped when she entered and everyone stared at her. The truck stop manager, a heavy-set woman in her 50s, immediately came over and guided Caitlin to a chair. She wrapped a blanket around Caitlin's shoulders and asked what had happened. Caitlin tried to explain, but the story came out confused and disjointed. She'd picked up a stranded family, but they weren't human, and they'd attacked her and she'd escaped into the forest. She couldn't find her car or the road she'd been on. The manager called the police, and within 20 minutes, a state trooper arrived. Caitlin told her story again, more coherently this time, but leaving out the parts about inhuman features and two sharp teeth, focusing instead on the attack and her escape. The trooper took notes and asked questions, particularly about where this had happened. "You said Ridge Road," the trooper asked, frowning. "Ma'am, there's no road by that name in this area. Are you sure that's what it was called?" "Yes," Caitlin insisted. "My GPS directed me there. It showed it as a shortcut." But when they looked at Caitlin's GPS, the handheld unit she kept in her car, which she'd apparently managed to grab during her escape, it showed no recent route history. And when they looked up Ridge Road in the area where Caitlin claimed to have been, they found nothing. No road by that name appeared on any map, physical or digital. Search teams went out at first light, trying to locate Caitlin's car based on her description of the area. They searched for 3 days, covering every mountain road within 50 miles of where Caitlin had emerged from the forest. They found nothing. No car, no broken-down SUV, no family, no evidence that Caitlin had ever been where she claimed to be. Caitlin's car was eventually discovered 2 weeks later, found in a parking lot in Knoxville, right back where she'd started her journey. It was undamaged and clean, all of her luggage still inside, arranged exactly as she'd packed it. The only difference was the mileage. The odometer showed she'd driven an additional 217 miles, though there was no record of where she'd been or how the car had gotten back to Knoxville. Caitlin never fully recovered from that night. She took a leave of absence from her teaching job and eventually moved to Atlanta, seeking anonymity in a city far from the mountains. She refuses to drive through Appalachia now, won't even look at maps of the region. Because she knows that somewhere in those mountains, there's a road called Ridge Road that appears when it wants to, when it's hungry, when it needs to feed on the kindness of strangers who stop to help what appears to be a stranded family. And sometimes, late at night, Caitlin hears her phone buzz with a notification even though she's turned it off and buried it in a drawer. When she finally gives in and checks it, there's always a message from a number she doesn't recognize, a message that says simply, "Thank you for stopping. We so enjoyed meeting you. We hope to see you again soon on Ridge Road. We're always here, always waiting for kind people like you. The children especially remember you. Emma asks about you often. She says you tasted like kindness and fear and she'd like to finish what she started. Come back and visit us. We're always here, always waiting. Always hungry for travelers who stop to help those in need. Ridge Road is easy to find if you know how to look. Just follow the GPS. It will bring you back to us. It always does." Story 8. The Auction House. Margaret Chen had been an antique dealer specializing in Appalachian folk art for 26 years, traveling throughout the mountain regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia in search of rare pieces, forgotten collections, and estate sales where treasures might be hiding among ordinary household goods. The 53-year-old owner of a successful gallery in Asheville, North Carolina, had an expert's eye for authentic period pieces and a deep appreciation for the craftsmanship and cultural significance of mountain traditions. She'd bought and sold thousands of items over her career, from quilts and pottery to furniture and musical instruments, and she prided herself on knowing the history and provenance of everything that passed through her hands. But on a cold February afternoon in 2023, Margaret walked into an auction house in rural West Virginia and found something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the region, its history, and the nature of reality itself. The auction was being held at a place called the Harmon Estate, located on a back road in Greenbrier County, about 30 miles from Lewisburg. Margaret had heard about the auction through her network of dealers and collectors. The Harmon family had lived in the area for over 200 years, and the estate was rumored to contain an exceptional collection of early American folk art and ephemera. The family had kept to themselves for generations, rarely selling or showing their possessions, and now the last of the Harmons had died without heirs, forcing the estate to be liquidated. Margaret arrived at the estate around noon, giving herself time to preview the items before the 2 o'clock auction start. The property was impressive, a 3-story brick house that dated to the early 1800s, surrounded by several outbuildings and sitting on at least 50 acres of land. Cars and trucks filled the driveway and parking area, indicating that news of the auction had spread widely through the antique and collecting community. The preview was set up in a large barn behind the main house, and as Margaret entered, she immediately knew this was going to be a significant sale. The barn was packed with furniture, artwork, quilts, pottery, and countless other items, all arranged in rows for viewing. Margaret could see pieces that were easily worth thousands of dollars, museum-quality examples of Appalachian craftsmanship from the 18th and 19th centuries. She spent over an hour examining items, taking notes and photographs, marking in her catalog which lots she was interested in bidding on. The competition would be fierce. She recognized several other dealers and at least 2 people she was certain represented museums. But Margaret had deep pockets from years of successful dealing, and she was determined to acquire several key pieces. She was examining a magnificent corner cupboard, noting the dovetail joinery and original hardware, when she noticed a door at the back of the barn that she hadn't seen before. It was partially hidden behind a tall wardrobe, and unlike the main barn doors, which were wide open to allow circulation, this door was closed. Above it hung a small hand-painted sign that read, "Additional items preview by request." Margaret found one of the auction house staff, a young man in his 20s wearing a yellow vest identifying him as a runner. "Excuse me, I noticed there's a room in the back with additional items. Can I view those?" The young man looked where Margaret was pointing and frowned. "I don't think we're showing those items, ma'am. They're not part of the main auction." "But the sign says preview by request," Margaret pressed. "I'd like to request a preview. Are they for sale?" The young man looked uncomfortable. "Let me check with my supervisor." He disappeared into the crowd, and Margaret waited, her curiosity now fully aroused. In her experience, the best pieces were often the ones that weren't prominently displayed, items that families wanted to sell quietly without drawing too much attention. The young man returned a few minutes later with an older woman, maybe in her 60s, who introduced herself as Patricia Klein, the estate administrator. "You're interested in viewing the back room?" Patricia asked, her tone neutral but with an undercurrent of something Margaret couldn't quite identify. Wariness, perhaps, or concern. "Yes, if that's possible," Margaret said. "I assume those items are also for sale." Patricia hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They are, yes, but I should warn you that they're unusual. The Harmon family kept these items separate from the rest of the collection. They have a specific history, and frankly, we've been debating whether to include them in the sale at all." "What kind of history?" Margaret asked, her interest intensifying. Items with controversial or dark histories often commanded premium prices from certain collectors. "I'd rather you see for yourself and make your own judgment," Patricia said. She led Margaret through the crowd to the back door, produced a key from her pocket, and unlocked it. "Please understand that we're selling these items as is, with no guarantees or warranties regarding their provenance or effects. The Harmon family documentation regarding these pieces is incomplete and somewhat disturbing. We're selling them purely at the request of the estate, but we accept no responsibility for what buyers choose to do with them. This was one of the strangest disclaimers Margaret had ever heard from an auction house, and she dealt with plenty of odd situations over the years. Patricia pushed open the door and reached inside to flip on a light switch. Take as much time as you need to preview. When you're finished, please make sure the door is closed and locked behind you. Margaret stepped into the room, and Patricia closed the door behind her. The space was smaller than the main barn, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with concrete floors and whitewashed walls. But what immediately struck Margaret was the atmosphere. The temperature in the room was noticeably colder than in the main barn, cold enough that she could see her breath, and there was a smell in the air, faint but distinctive, something like old paper and dried flowers with an undertone of something organic and slightly unpleasant. The items in the room were arranged on tables and shelves, and as Margaret began to examine them, she understood why the auction house had separated them from the main collection. These weren't typical antiques. They were objects that clearly had ritual or superstitious significance, items associated with folk magic, witch, and the darker aspects of Appalachian supernatural beliefs. There were dozens of witch bottles, old glass bottles filled with pins, needles, and other sharp objects, sealed with wax and used historically to protect against witchcraft. There were numerous spirit traps, complex objects made of wood and string and mirrors, designed to capture or confuse malevolent entities. Margaret saw something that looked like a wooden cage containing what appeared to be preserved human hair braided in intricate patterns. There were books, handwritten journals filled with incantations and recipes for charms. There were carved wooden masks with disturbing expressions, their surfaces darkened by age and possibly by smoke from ritual fires. Margaret was fascinated. She'd encountered folk magic items before in her career, but never a collection this extensive or well-preserved. These objects represented a serious study of Appalachian supernatural traditions, a collection that had clearly been assembled with purpose and maintained with care. The historical and cultural value was significant, even if many people would find the subject matter unsettling. She moved deeper into the room, examining items and taking notes. That's when she noticed the mirrors. An entire wall of the room was dedicated to mirrors of various sizes and styles, from small hand mirrors to large standing mirrors in elaborate frames. But these weren't ordinary antique mirrors. When Margaret looked into them, the reflections were wrong. Not grossly wrong, not obviously distorted or frightening, but subtly off in ways that took a moment to recognize. In one mirror, Margaret's reflection showed her standing in a slightly different position than she actually was, her head turned at a different angle. In another, her reflection was wearing different clothing, not the jeans and sweater she had on, but a dark dress she didn't own and had never seen before. In a third mirror, there was a figure standing behind her reflection, a tall shape that was just barely visible at the edge of the mirror's frame. But when Margaret spun around to look at the actual room behind her, there was no one there. Margaret stepped back from the mirrors, her heart beating faster. She was rational, skeptical, not given to believing in supernatural explanations for unusual phenomena. But there was something undeniably wrong about these mirrors, something that couldn't be explained by old glass or flawed silvering or tricks of light. She forced herself to look at the other items in the room, trying to ignore the mirrors and the reflections they showed. On a table in the center of the room was a large leather-bound book, and Margaret opened it to find a handwritten catalog of the collection. The entries were detailed, each object listed with its date of acquisition, its purported purpose or power, and often a warning or note about proper handling. Margaret read through several entries, her fascination growing despite her unease. The Harmon family had apparently been serious practitioners of Appalachian folk magic for generations, not as charlatans or entertainers, but as actual believers who treated these objects and practices with reverence and caution. The book documented over 200 years of collecting, with entries dating from the 1790s to just a few years ago. Then Margaret found an entry that made her blood run cold. It was dated September 15, 1843, and it described a set of mirrors, apparently the very mirrors hanging on the wall behind her. The entry read, "Acquired 7 mirrors from the estate of Silas Blackwood, executed for witchcraft and murder." Blackwood claimed the mirrors showed not reflections but truths, revealing what was hidden or what might be. He used them to spy on neighbors and discover their secrets. The mirrors are dangerous and should be destroyed, but Mother insists they are too valuable to lose. She has placed them in the back room with instructions that they are never to be looked into directly or for extended periods. Already, they have shown things that disturb the spirit and trouble the mind. I fear what may happen if they remain in our possession. Margaret closed the book and looked back at the mirrors. She should leave, should walk out of this room and forget about these objects. But professional curiosity and the potential value of the collection held her in place. These items, if authenticated and properly documented, could be worth a fortune to museums and serious collectors of occult memorabilia. Against her better judgment, Margaret approached the mirrors again, this time examining them more carefully, trying to understand what was creating the strange reflections. She looked into the largest mirror, a standing oval in an ornate frame of dark wood, and saw her reflection standing in what appeared to be the same room but different somehow. The walls behind her reflection were covered in symbols and writing, though when Margaret looked at the actual walls of the room, they were blank and whitewashed. As she watched, her reflection moved, not in sync with her actual movements, but independently. The reflection turned its head and looked directly at Margaret, making eye contact in a way that wouldn't be able to do. And the reflection smiled, a cold expression that didn't match anything Margaret was feeling, and raised one hand to place a finger against its lips in a gesture of silence or conspiracy. Margaret jerked back from the mirror, her heart pounding. She needed to leave, needed to get out of this room immediately. But as she turned toward the door, she noticed something that made her freeze. All of the mirrors were now showing the same thing, a reflection of Margaret standing in the center of the room, but in each mirror, there was a figure standing behind her. A tall, impossibly thin figure with elongated limbs and a face that was pale and blank except for dark hollows where eyes should be. The figure was in every mirror, getting closer in each successive reflection, as if it was moving through the mirrors toward the real world, toward the actual room where Margaret stood frozen in terror. And now Margaret could feel something behind her, could feel a presence that radiated cold and malevolence, could hear breathing that sounded like wind through dead trees. Margaret ran. She didn't look back, didn't check the mirrors again, just bolted for the door and grabbed the handle. It was locked. She rattled the handle desperately, pounding on the door and screaming for help, and behind her she could hear movement, could hear something approaching with footsteps that clicked like bone on concrete. The door burst open, and Patricia Cline stood there with a shocked expression, the young man in the yellow vest beside her. They grabbed Margaret and pulled her out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Margaret collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, shaking violently. "What happened?" Patricia demanded. "What did you see?" "The mirrors," Margaret managed to gasp out. There was something in the mirrors, something coming through. Patricia's face went pale. "You looked into the mirrors for how long?" "I don't know, a few minutes." "Why, what?" "The book warns against looking into them," Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Extended viewing allows them to see you to establish a connection." "Damn it, I should have been more explicit in my warning." "Allows what to see me?" Margaret asked, her rational mind still trying to find a logical explanation even as her instincts screamed that she'd encountered something genuinely dangerous and inexplicable. "We don't know exactly," Tricia said. The Harmon family journals describe them as the Watchers, or the ones between, entities that exist in the spaces between mirrors and reflections, between what is and what might be. The mirrors are doorways, and looking into them too long opens those doors from both sides. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist that there had to be a rational explanation, but she couldn't shake the memory of her reflection moving independently, of that terrible thin figure approaching through the layers of mirrored images, getting closer with each reflection until it was almost close enough to touch. She left the auction without bidding on anything, drove back to Asheville, and spent the next week in a state of nervous exhaustion. She couldn't look at mirrors without feeling watched, couldn't shake the sense that something had followed her home from that room in the Harmon barn. 10 days after the auction, Margaret received a package. There was no return address, just her name and address in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a small hand mirror, obviously old, with a tarnished silver frame, and attached to it was a note written in the same handwriting as the address. "You looked too long. You opened the door. Now we can see you wherever you go, whenever you look. Every mirror is our mirror now. Every reflection is our window. We see you, Margaret Chen of Asheville. We see you when you wake, when you sleep, when you think you're alone. We are always watching. And one day, when you look into a mirror at just the right moment, you'll see us looking back, and then we'll step through and you'll step back, and the exchange will be complete. You'll live in the spaces between and we'll live in your world. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. The mirrors show truth, you see. And the truth is that you're already one of us. You just don't know it yet." Margaret burned the mirror and the note immediately, but it didn't help, because she knows now that something is watching her from every reflective surface, waiting for the right moment, the right alignment, to complete whatever terrible transaction was initiated when she looked too long into those cursed mirrors in the back room of the Harmon barn. And sometimes, late at night, when Margaret accidentally catches her reflection in a dark window or a turned-off television screen, she sees her reflection smile at her with cold recognition, and she sees the thin, pale figure standing just behind her reflected shoulder, getting closer each time, patient and inexorable, waiting for the moment when the reflection and the real will trade places, and Margaret will discover what it means to exist in the spaces between mirrors. Trapped forever in the realm of the Watchers, while something ancient and terrible walks in the world wearing her face and living her life. Another successful transaction in a trade that has been going on for centuries in the dark hollows of Appalachia, where folk magic is more than superstition and mirrors show not reflections, but doorways to somewhere else. Story 9. The Lost Cemetery. Raymond Foster had been a geology researcher and cemetery preservationist for 34 years, specializing in locating and documenting abandoned graveyards throughout the Appalachian region. The 61-year-old retired history teacher from Pikeville, Kentucky, had found and cataloged over 300 forgotten burial sites, working with local historical societies to preserve them and reconnect them with descendants of those buried there. He maintained a detailed database, took rubbings of eroded headstones, and used ground-penetrating radar to locate unmarked graves. It was meticulous work that required patience, respect for the dead, and a willingness to venture into remote locations where cemeteries had been abandoned for decades or even centuries. Raymond had worked in all-weather conditions, had encountered black bears and copperhead snakes, had been lost in the woods more than once. But nothing in his 3 decades of experience prepared him for what he discovered on May 12, 2022, in a hollow in Letcher County, Kentucky, a cemetery that shouldn't exist, filled with graves that told an impossible story. Raymond had received a tip from a man named Howard Jessup, an elderly resident of Jenkins, Kentucky, who claimed to have stumbled upon an old cemetery while hunting ginseng in a remote hollow about 10 miles outside of town. Howard described finding at least 30 headstones, many of them quite old, in an area where no cemetery was shown on any map or recorded in any county document. He provided Raymond with rough directions and GPS coordinates, though he admitted the location was difficult to reach, requiring a hike of over 2 miles through dense forest with no trails. Raymond was intrigued. Finding an undocumented cemetery of that size would be a significant discovery, and the prospect of reconnecting families with their ancestors' burial sites made the difficult hike worthwhile. On a bright May morning, with his backpack loaded with camera equipment, measuring tools, notebook, and supplies for a long day in the field, Raymond drove to the coordinates Howard had provided and began his hike into the mountains. The terrain was rugged, exactly as Howard had described, with steep ridges and thick rhododendron thickets that made progress slow and exhausting. Raymond used his handheld GPS to navigate, following a route that took him up and over 2 ridges before descending into a narrow hollow that cut deep into the mountain. The forest here was old, with massive trees that now escaped the logging that had stripped most of these mountains a century ago, their canopy so thick that the forest floor was in permanent shadow. After 2.5 hours of hiking, Raymond reached the location Howard had marked on the GPS. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just more forest and underbrush. But as he pushed through a tangle of mountain laurel, he spotted the first headstone. It was slate, weathered and tilted at an angle, partially covered by moss and surrounded by encroaching vegetation. Raymond felt the familiar thrill of discovery as he approached the stone and carefully cleared away the moss to read the inscription. What he read made him pause and check his notes. The headstone belonged to someone named Eliza Morrison, with a death date of November 3rd, 1842. That was early enough to be historically significant, but what caught Raymond's attention was the birth date, February 12, 1823. Eliza had been only 19 when she died. Raymond photographed the stone, took measurements, and recorded the inscription in his notebook before moving on to search for additional graves. He found them scattered throughout the hollow, hidden among the trees and undergrowth. 37 headstones in total, just as Howard had estimated. Raymond spent the next several hours meticulously documenting each one, clearing away vegetation, photographing from multiple angles, taking rubbings of the inscriptions, and recording GPS coordinates for each grave location. The cemetery was indeed old, with death dates ranging from the 1820s to the 1880s, representing 3 generations of burials. But as Raymond worked, he began to notice patterns that troubled him. First, many of the death dates clustered around specific times: multiple burials in November 1842, several more in March 1857, a large number in October 1871. This wasn't unusual in itself. Disease outbreaks and harsh winters often caused clusters of deaths in frontier communities. But what disturbed Raymond was the ages of the deceased. Almost all of them had died young, in their teens or early 20s, and many of the inscriptions included phrases that seemed odd or ambiguous. Here lies Thomas Garrett, born June 1839, given November 1857. May he serve well in the darkness beneath. Sarah Pike, born April 1835, given October 1871. The mountain takes what the mountain needs. David Morrison, born September 1825, given November 1842 with his beloved sister Eliza. Together they descend to serve. Given, not died. Descend to serve. The mountain takes what it needs. These weren't typical epitaphs, and the more Raymond read, the more convinced he became that this cemetery was connected to something dark, something that the community had been involved in willingly or otherwise. Raymond was photographing the last few stones when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Several of the headstones had dates that didn't make sense. Not ancient dates or obvious errors, but dates that were wrong in a way that suggested something impossible. One stone, for a young woman named Catherine Boone, listed her birth year as 1851 and her death year as 1848. She had apparently died 3 years before she was born. Raymond checked his photographs, thinking he must have misread the inscription or that the stone was so weathered that he'd parsed the numbers incorrectly. But no, the inscription was clear. Catherine Boone, born 1851, given 1848. Time flows strange for those who serve. He found 3 more stones with similar impossible dates, death dates that preceded birth dates by years or even decades. And then Raymond noticed the pattern. All of the stones with impossible dates were clustered in one area of the cemetery, arranged in a circle around a flat stone slab that lay flush with the ground. The slab was large, maybe 8 feet square, and it was carved with symbols and text that Raymond didn't recognize. Not English, not any of the European languages that early Appalachian settlers would have used, but something else entirely. Characters that looked almost like letters but followed no linguistic pattern Raymond had ever encountered. Raymond photographed the slab and the surrounding stones, his professional curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. Something was very wrong with this cemetery, wrong in a way that went beyond historical mysteries or tragic deaths. The air in this part of the hollow felt heavier, colder, and Raymond realized he could no longer hear any forest sounds. No birds, no insects, no rustle of wind through the leaves. Just silence, profound and oppressive. He decided it was time to leave, to take his documentation back to town and research the names he'd found, try to trace the families and understand what had happened in this isolated hollow a century and a half ago. But as to retrace his path back through the forest, he realized he was no longer alone. People stood among the trees surrounding the cemetery, dozens of them, silent and motionless. They wore clothing from another era, simple homespun garments that might have been appropriate in the mid-1800s. Their faces were pale, almost luminous in the shadowed forest, and they stared at Raymond with expressions that conveyed no emotion. No curiosity, just blank acknowledgement of his presence. Raymond's first instinct was to call out, to ask who they were and what they were doing here, but something stopped him. These people, if they were people, hadn't been there moments ago. The forest had been completely empty. They had appeared silently, impossibly, and now they stood in a loose circle around the cemetery, blocking any path of escape. One of the figures stepped forward, a young woman who might have been 20 years old. She wore a simple dress and her dark hair was pulled back severely. Her face was beautiful but wrong somehow, the features too perfect, too symmetrical, like a painting rather than a living person. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "This place is not for the living, this place is for those who serve." "Who are you?" Raymond managed to ask, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" "We are the given," the woman replied. "We were offered to the mountain in exchange for prosperity, for protection, for the survival of our families. Every generation gives its youth to satisfy the old hunger that dwells beneath. We serve in the darkness, and in return our people thrive above. That is the covenant. That has always been the covenant." Raymond looked around at the other figures, seeing now that they matched the names and dates on the headstones. Eliza Morrison, Thomas Garrett, Sarah Pike, Catherine Boone, all of them standing there, young and unchanging, trapped in the moment of their deaths or their giving or whatever terrible thing had happened to them. "You died over 100 years ago," Raymond said, his mind struggling to accept what he was seeing. "This is impossible. You can't be real." "Death is not the end for those who serve the mountain," the woman said. "We exist in the spaces beneath, in the caverns that wind through the roots of the world, serving the ancient thing that has always been here, long before humans came to these hills. Our bodies are beneath your feet, buried in the earth, but we are not in those bodies. We are in the darkness, and the darkness is in us. We've been waiting for someone to find this place, someone to bear witness and bring others. The mountain is hungry again. The covenant must be renewed. A new generation must be given. Raymond backed away, his hands shaking. He nearly dropped his camera. I'm not part of this. I'm just here to document the cemetery. I don't know anything about your covenant or... You know now, the woman said, and the others began to move closer, closing the circle. You have seen, you have photographed the stone circle. You have read the names, you are connected now. The mountain sees you, and it is so very hungry. The figures were close now, reaching for Raymond with pale hands. He could see that their fingers were too long, the joints bending at angles that human fingers shouldn't bend. Their eyes, which had appeared normal from a distance, were completely black, no whites, no iris, just infinite darkness that seemed to pull at Raymond's vision, drawing him in. Raymond did the only thing he could. He ran directly at the weakest point in the circle, lowering his shoulder and barging through between two of the figures. They grabbed at him, their fingers catching in his clothes and leaving streaks of ice-cold numbness wherever they touched his skin. But Raymond's momentum carried him through, and then he was running, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or safety, just desperate to escape that hollow and the impossible people who stood guard over a cemetery that recorded deaths before births and marked graves that held bodies serving something ancient and terrible in caverns beneath the mountains. He ran for what felt like hours, completely lost, his GPS forgotten, his only goal to put as much distance as possible between himself and that place. He fell multiple times, tore his clothes on thorns and branches, lost his backpack somewhere along the way with all his equipment and documentation. But he didn't stop, didn't slow down until he burst out of the forest onto a gravel road, where a pickup truck nearly hit him before screeching to a stop. The driver, a local man who recognized Raymond from his cemetery preservation work, took him to the hospital in Whitesburg where Raymond was treated for exhaustion, dehydration, and numerous cuts and scrapes. When he tried to explain what he'd seen, the doctors assumed he'd become disoriented and delusional, possibly suffering from heat exhaustion despite the cool May temperature. They kept him overnight for observation and released him the next morning with instructions to rest and avoid strenuous activity. Raymond returned home to Pikeville and tried to make sense of what had happened. He'd lost all his documentation, all the photographs and notes from the cemetery. His GPS unit and camera were gone, left behind when he'd abandoned his backpack during his panic. He had no proof, no evidence, nothing but his own confused memories of impossible dates and people who should have been dead for over a century. He tried to find the cemetery again, making 3 more trips into the mountains with better equipment and more detailed planning. But he could never locate the hollow again. The GPS coordinates Howard Jessup had provided led to areas that looked nothing like what Raymond remembered, with no signs of any cemetery or even suitable terrain for burials. And when Raymond tried to contact Howard to get better directions or clarification, he discovered that no one in Jenkins had ever heard of anyone by that name. The man who had sent Raymond to the lost cemetery had apparently never existed. Raymond stopped doing cemetery preservation work after that experience. He couldn't look at old graveyards anymore without wondering what secrets they held, what impossible truths might be recorded on weathered stones if only someone knew how to read between the lines. He retired from his position with the Historical Society and moved to Louisville, seeking refuge in urban anonymity far from the isolated hollows and ancient mountains. But sometimes Raymond dreams about the cemetery. In his dreams, he's standing in that hollow again, surrounded by the pale figures who watch him with their black eyes. The young woman approaches him, that beautiful, terrible woman who spoke of covenants and service, and she takes his hand with fingers that are too long and too cold, and she says, "You are connected now. You saw the stone circle. You read the names. And when the mountain calls, when your time comes to join us in the service beneath, you will return. Everyone who finds this place returns eventually. The mountain is patient. It can wait. It has been waiting since before humans had names for time, and it will wait for you until your moment comes, and then you will walk into the forest and find the hollow waiting just where it's always been, and you'll descend through the stone circle into the caverns below where we serve in eternal darkness, feeding the ancient hunger that sustains and devours, that takes and gives. That is the secret heartbeat of these mountains, and always has been since the world began. Story 10. The Messenger. Kevin Bradley had been working as a rural mail carrier for the United States Postal Service for 19 years, covering a route in the mountains of southwestern Virginia that stretched over 80 miles and served approximately 300 mailboxes scattered across some of the most remote terrain in the eastern United States. The 44-year-old pride in his work, in knowing his customers by name and delivering not just mail, but a connection to the wider world for people who lived in isolated hollows and on mountaintops accessible only by rough dirt roads that tested his vehicle's capabilities and his driving skills. Kevin had delivered through blizzards and floods, had been chased by aggressive dogs and encountered black bears, had gotten stuck in mud and snow more times than he could count. But through it all, he'd maintained his perfect record of completing his route, getting the mail through no matter what obstacles he faced. That record ended on September 23, 2023, when Kevin received instructions to deliver a letter to an address that shouldn't exist, at the end of a road he'd never heard of, to a person who had been dead for over 50 years. The morning had started normally enough. Kevin arrived at the post office in Marion at 6 a.m., sorted his mail into delivery sequence, loaded it into his Jeep, and began his route at 7. The weather was perfect, early autumn sunshine and cool temperatures, the mountains blazing with fall colors. Kevin made his usual stops, exchanging pleasantries with customers who came out to their mailboxes to collect their deliveries, dropping packages on porches, and filling rural mailboxes with the steady flow of catalogs, bills, and letters that formed the daily communication lifeline for his route. Around 1 in the afternoon, Kevin reached the far end of his route, the most remote section where mailboxes were spaced miles apart, and the roads became increasingly primitive. He was about to turn around and begin working his way back toward town when he noticed something odd. There was a letter in his mailbag that he'd somehow missed during his morning sort, a single envelope that should have been delivered much earlier in the day. Kevin pulled over and examined the envelope. It was made of heavy, expensive paper, cream-colored and textured, the kind of stationery that wasn't commonly used anymore. The address was handwritten in elegant script. Mrs. Alina Pike, 17 Hollow Road, Cripple Creek, VA 24277. Kevin frowned. He'd been running this route for nearly 2 decades, and he knew every road and address in his territory. He'd never heard of Hollow Road, and he was certain there was no such street in Cripple Creek, which was a small, unincorporated community that consisted of maybe 20 houses scattered along a few miles of rural highway. He checked his route book, the comprehensive directory that listed every address in his territory. Hollow Road wasn't listed. He checked his GPS, typing in the address. The GPS couldn't find it. Kevin was about to mark the letter as undeliverable and return it to the post office when he noticed something else that made him deeply uncomfortable. The postmark on the envelope was dated September 23, 1973, exactly 50 years ago to the day. That was impossible. The Postal Service didn't use stamps like that anymore, and the cancellation mark was clearly vintage, not a reproduction. Someone had apparently held onto this letter for 50 years and then somehow inserted it into Kevin's mail today. But why? And how? Kevin's professional obligation was clear. He should return the letter to the post office as undeliverable and let his supervisor figure out what to do with it. But something about the letter bothered him, something beyond its obvious strangeness. The weight of it felt wrong, heavier than a single sheet of paper should be, and when Kevin held it up to the light, he could see that there was indeed something inside, but the shadows it cast were odd, suggesting shapes that didn't match any letter or document Kevin had ever seen. Against his better judgment, Kevin decided to try to deliver the letter. Maybe Hollow Road was some old local name for a road that had been officially renamed, something that longtime residents still used, but that wasn't on maps or GPS systems. Kevin drove into Cripple Creek and stopped at the small country store that served as the community's unofficial gathering place. Inside, he found the store owner, a man in his 70s named Carl Thompson who had lived in the area his entire life. "Carl, have you ever heard of Hollow Road?" Kevin asked. "Supposed to be somewhere around here." Carl's expression changed, friendly curiosity shifting to something more guarded. "Hollow Road. Haven't heard that name in a long time. Why are you asking about it?" "I've got a letter to deliver there," Kevin said, showing Carl the envelope. "Address says 17 Hollow Road. Do you know where that is?" Carl took the envelope and examined it, his face going pale as he read the name and saw the postmark. "Eleanor Pike," he said quietly. "Lord have mercy. Where did you get this?" "It was in my mailbag," Kevin said. "I don't know how it got there. Do you know her? Know where she lives?" "Eleanor Pike died in 1973, Carl said, handing the envelope back to Kevin like it was something contaminated. "September 23rd, 1973, to be exact. She was my aunt, and Hollow Road was the old name for a track that led up to her cabin back before the county gave it an official name and number. The cabin's been abandoned for 50 years. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. But someone's trying to send her a letter, dated from the day she died. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing about Eleanor's death made sense, Carl said. She lived alone up in that hollow, spent most of her time studying old books and collecting things related to folk traditions. People said she was a conjure woman, that she knew things she shouldn't and could do things that weren't natural. The day she died, several people in the area reported strange occurrences. Clocks stopping, mirrors breaking, animals acting crazy. They found her 3 days later sitting in her chair like she was waiting for something, dead with no obvious cause. And there was a letter on her table, addressed to her but never opened with that same postmark. September 23rd, 1973, the day she died. Postmaster said he never delivered any such letter, had no record of it, but there it was. "What happened to the letter?" Kevin asked. "Disappeared," Carl said. "Eleanor's sister, my mother, was going through her things and found the letter one day, but the next day when she went back to pack up more of Eleanor's belongings, the letter was gone. Never did find it again. And now you're telling me you've got another letter addressed to her with the same postmark." Carl shook his head. "That's not mail you want to be delivering, Kevin. That's something else entirely. Something that should be left alone." But Kevin was a mail carrier, and the unofficial motto of the Postal Service was that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night would stay them from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. A letter addressed to Eleanor Pike, even if she'd been dead for 50 years, deserved to be delivered to her last known address. It was a point of professional pride, even if it was also deeply irrational. "Can you tell me how to get to her old cabin?" Kevin asked. Carl gave him detailed directions, clearly reluctant but recognizing that Kevin was going to go whether he helped or not. Hollow Road, now designated as Secondary Route 643, was a dirt track that branched off the main highway about 2 miles past the store. The cabin was 3 miles up that track, at the end where the road dead ended against the base of a steep mountain. Kevin thanked Carl and drove to the turnoff. The track was in terrible condition, rutted and overgrown, clearly not maintained by the county and rarely used. Kevin's Jeep handled it well enough, though he had to navigate carefully around washouts and fallen branches. The forest pressed close on both sides. with undergrowth, and the afternoon light seemed dimmer here, filtered through heavy tree cover. After about 20 minutes of slow driving, Kevin emerged into a clearing and saw the cabin. It was still standing, surprisingly intact for a structure that had been abandoned for half a century. The roof sagged in places, and the porch was partially collapsed, but the walls were solid and most of the windows were still intact, dark and reflective in the afternoon light. Kevin parked his Jeep and approached the cabin carrying the letter. The mailbox, an old-fashioned rural box mounted on a post, still stood beside the front steps. It was rusted and the flag was broken, but Pike was still visible painted on the side in faded letters. Kevin opened the mailbox. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age and exposure. Kevin picked it up and felt his hands begin to shake. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Pike at 17 Hollow Road with a postmark dated September 23, 1973. The same letter Carl's mother had found and then lost 50 years ago, or another impossible letter from the same impossible sender. Kevin looked at the two letters, one fresh and crisp, one aged and brittle but otherwise identical. Who was sending these letters, and why? With shaking hands, Kevin opened the aged envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it was written in the same elegant script as the address. Dear Eleanor, the time has come. We have been watching and waiting, and we have determined that you are needed. Your studies have prepared you, your isolation has purified you, and your dedication has been noted. Tonight, at the stroke of midnight, step outside your door and walk into the forest. Follow the lights that you will see. They will guide you to the place beneath where we serve in eternal darkness. Do not fear. Do not resist. This is your purpose, the culmination of everything you have worked toward. You will serve, and in serving, you will become eternal. The mountain calls. Answer. The watchers beneath. Kevin read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to process what it meant. Was this some kind of death threat that Eleanor had received on the day she died? Had she followed these instructions and walked into the forest, where something terrible had happened to her before she somehow made it back to her cabin to die in her chair? But that didn't explain how her body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of what had killed her. Kevin looked at the fresh letter in his other hand, the one he was supposed to deliver today. With growing dread, he carefully opened it, violating federal law and post-regulations, but compelled by a need to know what was inside. The fresh letter contained the exact same message, word for word, except for one difference. At the bottom, below the signature of the watchers beneath, there was a postscript written in the same elegant script. P.S. This message is for the one who delivers it. You have been chosen to carry our summons. In accepting this letter, in bringing it to this place, you have accepted our call. Tonight, at the stroke of midnight, step outside your door and walk into the forest. The lights will be waiting. Your route ends here, carrier. Your service begins beneath. Kevin dropped both letters and backed away from the mailbox. The sun was lower now, shadows lengthening across the clearing, and Kevin noticed for the first time that the forest around the cabin was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no sound at all except his own breathing and the pounding of his heart. He ran back to his Jeep and fumbled with his keys.